The windswept landscapes of first-century Britain bore witness to a complex tapestry of tribal societies that had evolved over centuries of Iron Age development. Among these, the Iceni occupied a strategically significant territory stretching across what would later become Norfolk, Suffolk, and parts of Cambridgeshire. Their lands encompassed the fertile river valleys of the Wensum, Yare and Waveney, while extending eastward to the treacherous marshlands and coastal inlets that provided both protection and access to continental trade routes. The Iceni political structure reflected the sophisticated tribal organisation that characterised much of Iron Age Britain. Unlike the centralised monarchies that would later dominate European politics, Celtic society operated through a complex web of kinship groups, warrior bands, and territorial divisions. The tribe itself consisted of multiple subgroups or clans, each controlling specific territories within the broader Iceni domain. These smaller units maintained their own local leadership while acknowledging the authority of a paramount chief or king who ruled from fortified settlements known as oppida. Archaeological evidence from sites like Caister St Edmund reveals the impressive scale of these Iron Age strongholds. Massive earthwork defences, some reaching heights of over 20 feet, enclosed areas spanning hundreds of acres. Within these fortifications, archaeologists have uncovered evidence of specialised craft workshops, grain storage facilities, and residential areas that housed both the ruling elite and skilled artisans. The layout of these settlements demonstrates a clear understanding of defensive architecture, with multiple concentric rings of ditches and ramparts designed to funnel attackers into predetermined killing zones. The political authority of Iceni rulers extended far beyond simple military leadership. Kings and queens served as the focal point for complex networks of obligation and reciprocity that bound the tribe together. They redistributed wealth through elaborate feasting ceremonies, settled disputes between rival factions, and maintained the delicate balance of power that prevented internal warfare. This system of personal loyalty and mutual obligation, known to scholars as clientage, created bonds that transcended simple geographic boundaries and linked individuals across vast distances through chains of kinship and alliance. Celtic religious practices permeated every aspect of Iceni society, creating a worldview that recognised no clear distinction between the sacred and secular realms. The natural landscape itself served as a vast temple, with specific groves, springs, rivers and hilltops holding particular spiritual significance. Oak groves functioned as outdoor sanctuaries where the Druids conducted their most important ceremonies, while sacred springs provided focal points for offerings and ritual deposits. The Iceni, like other Celtic tribes, practiced a form of animism that attributed spiritual essence to natural features, creating a religious geography that influenced settlement patterns, trade routes, and territorial boundaries. The Druids themselves occupied a unique position within Celtic society that combined religious, legal, and educational functions. These learned individuals underwent training periods that could span 2 decades, memorising vast oral traditions that encompassed everything from religious mythology to legal precedents and astronomical observations. Within Iceni territory, Druids served as advisors to the ruling elite, mediators in disputes, and guardians of tribal memory. They conducted sacrificial rituals at key seasonal festivals, interpreted omens and divine signs, and maintained the complex calendrical systems that regulated agricultural and military activities. Archaeological discoveries throughout East Anglia have revealed the material evidence of these religious practices. Ritual deposits in rivers and bogs include weapons, jewellery, and human remains that suggest elaborate ceremonies involving water deities. The famous Snettisham Torcs, discovered in Norfolk, represent some of the finest examples of Celtic metalwork ever found. These twisted gold and silver neck rings, weighing several pounds each, were likely worn by high-ranking individuals during religious ceremonies before being deliberately deposited as offerings to the gods. The prominence of warrior queens within pre-Roman British society reflected broader Celtic attitudes toward gender and political authority that differed markedly from Mediterranean norms. Celtic women could inherit property, initiate divorce proceedings, and in certain circumstances rule tribes in their own right. This unusual degree of female autonomy stemmed from kinship systems that traced descent through both maternal and paternal lines, creating multiple pathways to political legitimacy. Among the Iceni, royal women often served as war leaders, religious figures, and diplomatic representatives, roles that required both martial prowess and spiritual authority. Celtic warrior culture celebrated individual combat skills and personal valour in ways that provided opportunities for exceptional women to achieve high status. Female warriors trained alongside their male counterparts in the use of swords, spears, and shields, while also mastering the art of chariot warfare that remained central to Celtic military tactics. These women wore the same types of armour and carried similar weapons, as evidenced by archaeological finds from female burials that include iron spearheads, bronze shields, and elaborate horse gear associated with chariot fighting. The economic foundation of Iceni society rested on a sophisticated agricultural system that had developed over centuries of Iron Age innovation. The fertile soils of East Anglia supported extensive cultivation of wheat, barley, and other cereal crops, while the region's numerous rivers provided water for both irrigation and transportation. Archaeological evidence from sites like Fyzen Way reveals large-scale grain storage facilities that could hold surplus harvests for multiple years, suggesting a level of agricultural planning that extended far beyond subsistence farming. Iceni farmers employed iron-tipped ploughs pulled by oxen to break the heavy clay soils that characterized much of their territory. These technological innovations allowed them to cultivate areas that had previously been unsuitable for agriculture, expanding the tribe's food production capacity and supporting larger population concentrations. Field systems discovered through aerial photography show evidence of careful land management, with field boundaries, drainage ditches, and trackways that remained in use for centuries. Livestock played an equally important role in the Iceni economy. Cattle provided meat, milk, leather, and bone for tool-making, while also serving as units of exchange in a society that had not yet fully adopted coinage. Archaeological analysis of animal remains from Iceni settlements reveals selective breeding practices designed to produce larger, more robust animals. Horses held particular significance, both for their practical utility in warfare and transportation, and for their symbolic association with elite status and divine power. The Iceni maintained extensive trade networks that connected their territory to markets throughout Britain and continental Europe. Archaeological evidence demonstrates regular exchange relationships with tribes in modern-day France, Germany, and the Low Countries. Imported goods found in Iceni settlements include Mediterranean wine amphorae, Gallic pottery, and exotic materials like amber from the Baltic region and jet from Yorkshire. These trade connections provided access to raw materials unavailable locally, while creating diplomatic relationships that could be activated during times of conflict or crisis. Metalworking traditions among the Iceni reached extraordinary levels of sophistication, producing both practical tools and ceremonial objects of remarkable artistry. Ironsmiths created weapons, agricultural implements, and household items using techniques that had been refined over generations of practice. The tribe's metalworkers had mastered complex processes like pattern welding for sword blades and lost wax casting for bronze ornaments. Their workshops, identified at sites throughout East Anglia, contained specialised tools, furnaces, and raw materials that indicate full-time craft specialisation. Gold and silver working represented the pinnacle of Iceni metalworking achievement. The famous Snettisham treasure demonstrates mastery of techniques, including wire drawing, granulation, and complex alloy manipulation. These precious metal objects served multiple functions as displays of wealth, religious offerings, and diplomatic gifts. The intricate Celtic art styles that decorated these pieces incorporated motifs drawn from the natural world, transformed through abstract geometric patterns that created distinctly Celtic aesthetic traditions. Social stratification within Iceni society followed patterns common throughout the Celtic world, but with distinctive local variations that reflected the tribe's particular history and environment. At the apex of the social hierarchy stood the royal family and their immediate relatives, followed by a warrior aristocracy that controlled most of the tribe's land and livestock. These elite groups lived in substantial roundhouses within fortified settlements, surrounded by evidence of their wealth in the form of imported goods, fine metalwork, and elaborate personal ornaments. Below the aristocracy, a broad middle class of free farmers, craftspeople and traders formed the economic backbone of Iceni society. These individuals owned their own land and livestock, participated in local assemblies, and could bear arms in the tribal militia. Archaeological evidence suggests that this middle class enjoyed a relatively comfortable standard of living, with access to iron tools, pottery, and other manufactured goods that improved their daily lives. The lowest tier of Iceni society consisted of slaves and debt bondsmen who worked the land of their social superiors. However, Celtic slavery differed significantly from later Roman practices, often functioning more as a form of temporary servitude that could be ended through military service or the payment of debts. Slaves could own property, marry free individuals, and in some cases achieve manumission through exceptional service or skill. Gender roles within Iceni society reflected the broader Celtic pattern of relative equality compared to contemporary Mediterranean civilizations. Women could own property independently of their male relatives, engage in trade and craft production, and participate in religious ceremonies as priestesses or druids. Marriage customs allowed for divorce initiated by either party, while inheritance laws recognized claims through both paternal and maternal lineages. This flexibility in gender roles created opportunities for exceptional individuals to transcend traditional boundaries and achieve positions of significant political authority. The unusual prominence of female rulers among the Celts stemmed from religious beliefs that associated women with divine wisdom and prophetic power. Celtic goddesses often embodied concepts of sovereignty and territorial protection, creating mythological precedents for female political authority. Queens like Cartimandua of the Brigantes and later Boudica herself drew legitimacy from these religious traditions, presenting themselves as earthly representatives of powerful female deities who protected tribal territories from external threats. The death of Emperor Caligula in 41 AD brought his uncle Claudius to power under circumstances that left the new ruler desperate to establish military credibility. Unlike his predecessors, Claudius lacked significant military experience and faced skepticism from both the Senate and the Praetorian Guard regarding his fitness to rule. The conquest of Britain presented an opportunity to demonstrate Roman strength, while claiming a prize that had eluded even Julius Caesar a century earlier. Claudius understood that successful military campaigns beyond the empire's frontiers would silence his critics and provide the triumphal glory necessary to legitimize his reign. The invasion force assembled in Gaul during the spring of 43 AD represented one of the largest military expeditions Rome had mounted in decades. 4 legions formed the expedition's backbone: Legio II Augusta, Legio IX Hispana, Legio XIV Gemina, and Legio IX Valeria Victrix. Each legion brought approximately 5,000 heavily armed infantry supported by auxiliary units recruited from across the empire. Gallic cavalry squadrons, Germanic infantry cohorts, and Balearic slingers augmented the legionary forces, creating a combined strength exceeding 40,000 professional soldiers. This massive force required months of logistical preparation, including the construction of transport vessels, accumulation of supplies, and establishment of supply depots along the Gallic coast. Emperor Claudius selected Aulus Plautius, an experienced senator with proven military credentials, to command the invasion. Plautius had previously served as governor of Pannonia, where he had successfully managed complex tribal relationships while maintaining frontier security. His appointment reflected Claudius's recognition that conquering Britain would require not merely military victory, but also sophisticated diplomatic skills to navigate the intricate web of Celtic tribal politics. Plautius brought with him a staff of experienced officers, including the future Emperor Vespasian, who commanded Legio II Augusta and Gnaeus Hosidius Geta, whose tactical innovations would prove crucial in the coming campaigns. The Roman fleet departed from Gesoriacum in multiple waves during late spring 43 AD, with advance forces landing at Rutupiae in Kent, while secondary landings occurred at sites along the south coast. The Britons had expected the invasion and assembled substantial forces under the leadership of Caraticus and Togodumnus, sons of the deceased Catuvellaunian king Cunobelinus. However, the scale and coordination of the Roman assault overwhelmed initial British resistance. The invaders established fortified beachheads with remarkable efficiency, constructing earth and timber fortifications that provided secure bases for further operations. The first major engagement occurred at the river Medway, where British forces attempted to halt the Roman advance toward the tribal heartlands of southeastern Britain. The battle demonstrated the tactical superiority of Roman military organisation over Celtic warrior traditions. While British charioteers and infantry fought with individual courage, they lacked the disciplined formations and coordinated manoeuvres that characterised Roman warfare. Auxiliary units crossed the river at unexpected points, while legionary engineers constructed pontoon bridges under combat conditions, allowing the main force to outflank British defensive positions. The defeat at Medway shattered the initial British coalition and forced surviving tribal leaders to reconsider their strategic options. Following this victory, Roman forces advanced rapidly toward Camulodunum, the principal settlement of the Catuvellauni and symbolic centre of British resistance. The capture of this fortified oppidum provided Claudius with the dramatic backdrop he needed for his personal arrival in Britain. The emperor crossed the channel with reinforcements that included war elephants, exotic creatures calculated to impress both Roman troops and British observers with the empire's vast resources. Claudius remained in Britain for only 16 days, but his presence during the final assault on Camulodunum allowed him to claim personal credit for the conquest while receiving the formal submission of numerous tribal leaders. The establishment of Roman administrative control over conquered territories required careful balance between military dominance and political accommodation. Plautius and his successors recognised that permanent occupation of Britain would prove impossible without cooperation from significant portions of the native population. The Roman solution involved creating a network of client kingdoms that maintained the appearance of local autonomy while ensuring ultimate loyalty to imperial authority. This system allowed Rome to control vast territories with relatively modest military commitments, while providing pathways for ambitious Celtic leaders to maintain status and influence within the new order. The client kingdom arrangement offered substantial advantages to both parties involved in these relationships. Roman administrators gained reliable local allies who understood tribal customs, territorial boundaries, and political dynamics that would have taken decades for outsiders to master. Client rulers received imperial protection against external enemies, access to Roman trade networks, and opportunities to acquire luxury goods that enhanced their prestige among their own people. The system also provided mechanisms for gradual cultural transformation, as client kings adopted Roman administrative practices, architectural styles, and social customs that gradually permeated their societies. Prasutagus emerged as king of the Iceni during this period of dramatic political transformation, though the exact circumstances of his rise to power remain obscured by limited historical sources. The Iceni had initially resisted Roman invasion, possibly participating in the broader British coalition that opposed Plautius's advance. However, the tribe's geographic position in East Anglia, relatively distant from the main theatres of military operation, may have allowed them to avoid the devastating defeats that befell tribes closer to the invasion routes. Prasutagus likely recognised that continued resistance would prove futile against Roman military superiority and chose to negotiate terms that preserved his people's autonomy while acknowledging imperial supremacy. The transformation of Prasutagus from potential enemy to client ruler illustrates the pragmatic flexibility that characterized Roman imperial administration. Rather than attempting to impose direct control over every conquered territory, Roman officials preferred to work through existing power structures when possible. This approach reduced administrative costs while minimizing the risk of rebellion among populations who retained familiar leaders. For Prasutagus, accepting client status provided opportunities to modernize his kingdom's infrastructure, expand trade relationships, and strengthen his position relative to rival tribal leaders who had chosen continued resistance. Archaeological evidence from Iceni territory during this period reveals the material consequences of integration into the Roman world. Imported pottery, metalwork, and architectural elements appear in increasing quantities at sites throughout East Anglia, indicating expanded trade relationships and changing consumer preferences among the tribal elite. Roman coins begin appearing in archaeological contexts, suggesting the gradual monetization of an economy that had previously relied primarily on barter and gift exchange. These material changes reflect deeper transformations in social organization, as traditional Celtic customs adapted to accommodate Roman legal concepts, administrative practices, and cultural values. The process of Romanization proceeded at different rates among various segments of Iceni society, creating tensions that would later contribute to the rebellion of 61 AD. The tribal aristocracy, including Prasutagus and his court, adopted Roman customs most readily, recognizing the advantages that imperial favour could provide. Elite Iceni began constructing villa-style residences, wearing Roman clothing, and educating their children in Latin language and literature. These cultural adaptations served practical purposes, as familiarity with Roman customs facilitated diplomatic negotiations and commercial transactions with imperial officials and merchants. However, the broader population of farmers, craftspeople, and labourers experienced Romanization primarily through increased taxation, military recruitment, and interference with traditional religious practices. Roman tax collectors demanded payments in coin rather than agricultural produce, forcing many Iceni to enter monetary relationships for the first time. The establishment of Roman military installations required local communities to provide supplies, labour, and quarters for troops, creating additional economic burdens that strained traditional subsistence patterns. These pressures generated resentment among segments of the population who perceived few benefits from their tribe's accommodation with imperial authority. Religious tensions proved particularly problematic as Roman officials gradually restricted traditional Celtic practices that conflicted with imperial law or Christian influences. The Druids faced systematic persecution throughout Britain as Roman administrators recognized their role in maintaining Celtic cultural identity and potential resistance to imperial rule. Sacred groves were cut down, ritual sites were abandoned or converted to Roman purposes, and the complex oral traditions that had preserved Celtic law and custom for centuries began to erode. These changes struck at the heart of Iceni identity, undermining the spiritual foundations that had previously unified the tribe and legitimized royal authority. The establishment of Roman colonies at strategic locations throughout Britain created additional sources of tension with client kingdoms. Camalodunum became the first colonial settlement, designed to provide homes for retired legionary veterans, while serving as a visible symbol of Roman permanence in Britain. The colonists received substantial land grants, carved from territories that had previously belonged to local tribes, creating resentment among displaced populations who received little or no compensation for their losses. The colonial veterans often treated native Britons with contempt, viewing themselves as representatives of superior civilization among barbarian peoples. Roman legal concepts gradually penetrated Iceni society through commercial relationships and administrative requirements, challenging traditional Celtic approaches to property ownership, inheritance, and dispute resolution. Roman law emphasized individual ownership rights and written contracts, while Celtic custom had relied on collective decision-making and oral agreements validated by community witnesses. These different legal traditions created confusion and conflict when disputes arose between Romans and Britons, or when traditional Celtic practices conflicted with imperial regulations. The gradual erosion of Celtic legal autonomy represented a fundamental challenge to tribal sovereignty that many Iceni found increasingly difficult to accept. Military service requirements imposed additional strains on Iceni society, as Roman officials demanded auxiliary troops to support ongoing campaigns in Wales and northern Britain. Young Iceni warriors found themselves serving far from their homeland under Roman officers, who often showed little understanding of or respect for Celtic military traditions. These service obligations removed productive individuals from their communities, while exposing them to Roman military culture that emphasized discipline, hierarchy, and absolute obedience to imperial authority. Veterans returning from Roman service often brought changed attitudes that created tensions with traditional tribal values and customs. The gradual transformation of Iceni territory during the 40s and 50s AD created a complex social environment characterized by both opportunity and tension. Prasutages navigated these challenges with considerable skill, maintaining his people's nominal independence while adapting to Roman expectations and requirements. However, the underlying contradictions between Celtic tradition and Roman administration continued to generate pressures that would eventually overwhelm the client kingdom system and lead to the dramatic events that would define Boudica's legacy. The historical record concerning Boudica's origins remains frustratingly sparse, reflecting the broader challenge of reconstructing pre-Roman British biography from sources written entirely by external observers. Roman historians like Tacitus and Cassius Dio, our primary authorities for her story, showed little interest in documenting the early lives of barbarian leaders, focusing instead on their interactions with imperial authority. This scholarly neglect means that Boudica's birth, childhood, and formative experiences within Iceni royal society must be reconstructed through careful analysis of contemporary social structures, archaeological evidence, and the few tantalizing details that survived in classical accounts. The absence of written records from pre-Roman Britain compounds these difficulties, as Celtic societies relied entirely on oral tradition to preserve historical memory. The Druids who served as repositories of tribal knowledge were systematically persecuted by Roman authorities, taking with them vast stores of information about royal genealogies, political relationships, and cultural practices that might have illuminated Boudica's background. Archaeological evidence provides some insights into the material conditions of Iceni elite society during the mid-1st century, but cannot reveal the personal circumstances that shaped her character or the specific events that prepared her for leadership. What emerges from the available evidence suggests that Boudica belonged to the highest tier of Iceni aristocracy, possibly connected to the royal family through birth rather than marriage alone. Her later demonstration of political authority, military leadership, and rhetorical skill indicates an upbringing that provided access to the full range of elite Celtic education. This would have included training in warfare, horsemanship, and the complex oral traditions that preserve tribal law, religious knowledge, and historical memory. The confidence with which she later assumed command of multiple tribes suggests familiarity with intertribal politics, and diplomatic protocols that typically required years of observation and participation in royal court activities. Celtic naming conventions provide some clues about Boudica's possible origins and social status. Her name derives from the Brittonic word Bouda, meaning victory, suggesting that she may have been named to commemorate a military success or born during a period of tribal triumph. The suffix "ica" indicates a diminutive or affectionate form, possibly meaning little victory or victorious one. Such names were typically reserved for children of high-ranking families who could reasonably expect to achieve significant accomplishments. The name itself implies expectations of martial prowess and political success that proved remarkably prophetic given her later career. The social environment of mid-1st century Iceni society would have provided numerous opportunities for an aristocratic woman to develop the skills necessary for political leadership. Celtic culture recognized female participation in warfare, diplomacy, and religious activities to a degree that shocked Roman observers accustomed to more restrictive gender roles. Young women of royal blood received training in weapons handling, chariot driving, and mounted combat alongside their male counterparts. They also participated in religious ceremonies, learned the complex oral traditions that preserve tribal memory, and observed the political negotiations that determined intertribal relationships and territorial boundaries. Archaeological discoveries from Iceni territory during this period reveal the material culture that would have surrounded Boudica's youth. Elaborate metalwork, imported pottery, and sophisticated architectural remains demonstrate the wealth and cultural sophistication of the tribal elite. The famous Snettisham torques, discovered in Norfolk, represent the type of precious ornaments that high-ranking Iceni women would have worn during ceremonial occasions. These twisted gold and silver neck rings, some weighing several pounds, required exceptional metalworking skill to produce and represented enormous concentrations of wealth that only the most powerful families could afford. The marriage between Boudica and Prasutagus likely occurred during the late 40s or early 50s AD, as the Iceni kingdom adapted to its new status as a Roman client state. This union represented far more than a personal relationship between two individuals. It constituted a crucial political alliance that strengthened Prasutagus's claim to royal authority, while potentially uniting different factions within the tribe. Celtic marriage customs differed significantly from Roman practices, allowing for greater female autonomy and recognizing women's independent property rights. These legal traditions would prove crucial in later disputes over succession and inheritance that contributed to the outbreak of rebellion. The political dynamics surrounding their marriage reflect the complex challenges facing Celtic rulers during the early years of Roman occupation. Prasutagus needed to demonstrate strength and legitimacy to his own people while maintaining the delicate relationship with imperial authorities that ensured his kingdom's survival. A marriage alliance with a woman of demonstrated political skill and possibly independent power base would have served multiple strategic purposes. It provided domestic stability, strengthened his position relative to potential rivals, and created the possibility of female succession that Celtic law recognized but Roman custom typically rejected. Boudica's role as queen consort involved far more than ceremonial duties or household management. Celtic queens served as active political partners who participated in diplomatic negotiations, military planning, and religious ceremonies that legitimized royal authority. Archaeological evidence from other British sites suggests that high-ranking Celtic women maintained their own retinues of warriors and advisors, controlled independent sources of wealth, and exercised territorial authority over specific regions within their husbands' domains. This active political participation prepared Boudica for the leadership responsibilities she would later assume while providing her with networks of personal loyalty that transcended traditional tribal boundaries. The client kingdom arrangement that governed Iceni relations with Rome created unprecedented challenges for traditional Celtic political structures. Prasutagus and Boudica had to balance competing demands from their own people, who expected adherence to ancestral customs and protection of tribal interests, and Roman officials, who required demonstrations of loyalty and compliance with imperial policies. This balancing act required sophisticated diplomatic skills and deep understanding of both Celtic and Roman political cultures. The royal couple needed to appear sufficiently Romanized to satisfy imperial expectations while maintaining enough traditional authority to command tribal loyalty. Evidence suggests that Boudica and Prasutagus adopted selective aspects of Roman culture while preserving core Celtic traditions that defined their people's identity. Archaeological findings from Iceni territory during this period reveal increasing quantities of Roman manufactured goods, architectural elements, and artistic styles, indicating growing integration with imperial commercial networks. However, these material changes coexisted with continued use of traditional Celtic religious sites, burial practices, and artistic motifs that maintained connections to pre-Roman cultural traditions. This cultural synthesis reflected deliberate political choices designed to maximize the benefits of Roman alliance, while minimizing the erosion of tribal autonomy. The royal court at the Iceni capital would have served as a focal point for this cultural negotiation, bringing together traditional Celtic aristocrats, Roman officials, and merchants from across the empire. Boudica's position as queen required her to navigate these complex social interactions while maintaining the respect and loyalty of diverse constituencies with often conflicting interests and expectations. Her later ability to unite multiple tribes in rebellion suggests exceptional diplomatic skills developed through years of managing these challenging political relationships. The question of Boudica's children represents another area where historical sources provide frustratingly limited information. Tacitus mentions 2 daughters, but provides no details about their names, ages, or personalities. Cassius Dio similarly references the daughters without elaboration, focusing instead on their role as victims of Roman brutality that helped precipitate the rebellion. This lack of detailed information reflects the Roman historian's primary interest in political and military events, rather than family relationships or personal circumstances. The existence of daughters rather than sons created significant complications for Iceni's succession planning under the client kingdom arrangement. Celtic inheritance law recognized female succession rights and allowed property to pass through maternal as well as paternal lineages. However, Roman legal traditions typically favored male heirs and viewed female rule with suspicion or outright hostility. This fundamental conflict between Celtic and Roman succession practices would later contribute to the crisis that followed Prasutagus's death and provided the immediate catalyst for Boudica's rebellion. The education and preparation of these daughters for potential leadership roles would have followed traditional Celtic patterns that emphasize practical skills alongside cultural knowledge. Royal daughters learned weapons handling, horsemanship, and military tactics that prepared them for the possibility of leading their people in warfare. They also received training in law, diplomacy, and religious practices that would enable them to serve as effective rulers if circumstances required. This comprehensive education reflected Celtic recognition that political authority might pass to female heirs, and that queens needed the same range of skills as their male counterparts. Archaeological evidence suggests that the royal family maintained residences that blended Celtic and Roman architectural elements, creating physical spaces that reflected their complex political position. These structures likely included traditional roundhouses for ceremonial purposes alongside more Romanized buildings, designed to impress imperial visitors and demonstrate the kingdom's integration with imperial culture. The maintenance of both architectural traditions provided venues for different types of political activities, while allowing the royal family to present appropriate images to various constituencies. The gradual transformation of Iceni society during Boudica's years as queen consort created mounting tensions that would eventually overwhelm the client kingdom system. Increased taxation to fund Roman military operations, recruitment of young men for auxiliary service, and restrictions on traditional religious practices generated resentment among segments of the population who saw few benefits from their rulers' accommodation with imperial authority. Boudica's position required her to mediate between these competing pressures while maintaining the political stability necessary for the kingdom's survival. The religious dimensions of Boudica's role as queen deserve particular attention, as Celtic queens often served important functions in tribal spiritual life. Archaeological evidence from Iceni territory includes numerous ritual sites, sacred springs, and ceremonial deposits that suggest continued adherence to traditional religious practices despite Roman pressure for cultural assimilation. Boudica's later ability to inspire religious fervour among her followers indicates deep familiarity with Celtic spiritual traditions and possible training as a priestess or religious leader, in addition to her political responsibilities. The complexity of managing relationships with Roman officials while preserving tribal autonomy required constant vigilance and sophisticated political judgment. Imperial representatives expected regular demonstrations of loyalty, compliance with Roman legal requirements, and cooperation in military operations against other British tribes. However, excessive accommodation with Roman demands risked alienating traditional supporters who viewed such cooperation as a betrayal of ancestral values and tribal independence. Boudica's navigation of these treacherous political waters during her years as queen consort provided crucial preparation for the far greater challenges she would face after her husband's death. The death of King Prasutagus in 60 AD marked the catastrophic end of nearly 2 decades of careful diplomatic balance between Iceni independence and Roman imperial demands. Contemporary sources provide no details about the circumstances of his death, whether from illness, injury, or natural causes, but the timing proved disastrous for his kingdom's survival. Prasutagus had spent years cultivating relationships with Roman administrators while maintaining the loyalty of his tribal subjects, walking the precarious line between collaboration and resistance that defined client kingdom politics throughout the empire. His sudden absence removed the one figure capable of managing these competing pressures and left the Iceni vulnerable to the predatory instincts of Roman officials who had long coveted the tribe's accumulated wealth. The will that Prasutagus left behind represented his final attempt to preserve his people's autonomy through legal accommodation with Roman inheritance practices. According to Tacitus, the Iceni king bequeathed half of his kingdom to Emperor Nero, while designating his 2 daughters as heirs to the remaining portion. This arrangement reflected sophisticated understanding of Roman legal concepts and imperial expectations, as client rulers throughout the empire routinely named the emperor as co-heir to demonstrate loyalty and ensure imperial protection for their successors. Prasutagus likely believed that this gesture of submission would satisfy Roman requirements, while preserving enough independent authority for his family to continue governing the Iceni under imperial oversight. The legal framework underlying this testamentary arrangement drew from both Celtic and Roman traditions in ways that created fundamental ambiguities about succession rights and territorial control. Celtic inheritance law recognized female succession and allowed property to pass through maternal lineages, providing clear legal precedent for the daughter's claims to royal authority. However, Roman legal practice typically favoured male heirs and viewed female rule with suspicion, particularly in contexts involving military command and territorial administration. The attempt to reconcile these conflicting legal systems through a compromise arrangement ultimately satisfied neither tradition and provided Roman officials with pretexts for rejecting the entire settlement. The imperial portion of the bequest presented additional complications that Prasutagus may not have fully anticipated. Roman law distinguished between different types of imperial inheritance, with some bequests becoming personal property of the emperor, while others were incorporated into the imperial treasury or provincial administration. The ambiguous language of Celtic legal traditions, transmitted through oral rather than written forms, made precise definition of the emperor's rights extremely difficult. Roman administrators could interpret the bequest broadly to claim not merely half the kingdom's wealth, but also governmental authority over the entire territory, effectively ending Iceni independence, regardless of the daughter's theoretical inheritance rights. The Roman response to Prasutagus' death revealed the fundamental cynicism underlying the client kingdom system throughout Britain. Rather than honouring the carefully crafted succession arrangement, imperial officials saw the king's death as an opportunity to eliminate Iceni autonomy and seize direct control over the tribe's substantial resources. The procurator Catus Decianus, responsible for financial administration throughout the province, immediately dispatched agents to conduct a comprehensive inventory of Iceni assets. These officials operated under instructions that treated the entire kingdom as imperial property subject to confiscation, ignoring both the terms of Prasutagus' will and the legal rights of his surviving family members. Archaeological evidence from Iceni territory suggests the scale of wealth that attracted Roman attention following Prasutagus' death. Excavations at sites throughout Norfolk and Suffolk have revealed substantial hoards of gold and silver objects, including the famous Snettisham Talks and numerous coin deposits that represent enormous concentrations of precious metals. The Iceni had accumulated this wealth through decades of successful agriculture, craft production, and trade relationships that extended across northern Europe. Roman officials recognized that direct control over these resources would provide substantial revenues for imperial coffers, while eliminating the need to share profits with client rulers who demanded compensation for their cooperation. The systematic confiscation of Iceni property proceeded with ruthless efficiency that demonstrated long-standing Roman preparation for this eventuality. Imperial agents arrived with detailed knowledge of the kingdom's principal settlements, storage facilities, and wealthy families, suggesting extensive intelligence gathering during the preceding years of client status. They seized livestock herds, grain stores, metalwork workshops, and personal possessions belonging to the royal family and tribal aristocracy. The confiscations extended beyond material wealth to include slaves, land rights, and territorial privileges that form the foundation of Iceni political and economic power. The legal justification for these seizures rested on Roman claims that client kingdoms existed only at imperial sufferance and possessed no inherent rights to independence or self-governance. Imperial legal theorists argued that barbarian tribes lacked the civilizational sophistication necessary for true sovereignty, and therefore held their territories as conditional grants from the emperor, rather than as independent possessions. This interpretation allowed Roman administrators to treat Prasutagus' death as the automatic termination of Iceni political autonomy, reducing the tribe to the status of a directly administered provincial territory, subject to standard imperial taxation and governance. The treatment of Boudica herself during this period of confiscation revealed the particular brutality that Roman officials reserved for those who challenged their authority. According to Tacitus, she was publicly flogged as punishment for protesting the seizure of her family's property and the violation of her husband's testamentary arrangements. This punishment carried profound symbolic significance within both Roman and Celtic cultural contexts, as public flogging was typically reserved for slaves and criminals rather than free individuals of high social status. The deliberate humiliation of the Iceni queen demonstrated Roman contempt for Celtic concepts of royal dignity, while serving as a warning to other tribal leaders who might consider resistance to imperial demands. The sexual violence inflicted upon Boudica's daughters represented an even more devastating assault on Iceni royal authority and Celtic cultural values. Roman soldiers violated the young women in circumstances that suggest deliberate policy rather than random criminal behaviour. This systematic brutalization served multiple purposes within Roman colonial strategy. It eliminated potential claimants to Iceni royal succession, demonstrated the helplessness of Celtic leaders to protect their own families, and provided visceral proof of Roman dominance over conquered populations. The violation of royal women struck at the heart of Celtic concepts of sovereignty and sacred kingship, transforming what might have remained a legal dispute into a fundamental challenge to tribal survival and cultural identity. The broader pattern of Roman administrative corruption throughout Britain during this period provides essential context for understanding the particular brutality visited upon the Iceni royal family. Procurator Catus Decianus had established a systematic program of exploitation that targeted client kingdoms across the province, using legal pretexts to seize tribal wealth while enriching himself and his associates. Similar patterns of abuse had occurred among the Trinovantes, whose territories around Camulodunum had been systematically confiscated to provide land grants for Roman colonial veterans. The Brigantes in northern England faced comparable pressures, with Roman officials interfering in succession disputes to install compliant rulers who would facilitate resource extraction. The economic motivations driving this systematic exploitation reflected broader imperial financial pressures that had intensified during Nero's reign. The emperor's extravagant spending on public entertainment, architectural projects, and personal luxury had strained imperial finances, while provincial administrators faced increasing pressure to generate revenues for the central treasury. Britain represented a particularly attractive target for financial exploitation, as the province's client kingdoms had accumulated substantial wealth during their years of nominal independence, while lacking the military strength to resist imperial demands. The systematic looting of these kingdoms provided short-term financial relief for imperial coffers, while creating the conditions for widespread rebellion. The role of Roman military units in implementing these confiscation policies reveals the extent to which the imperial army had become an instrument of economic exploitation rather than territorial defence. Legionary detachments and auxiliary cohorts provided muscle for civilian administrators who lacked the authority to compel compliance with confiscation orders. These military units operated under orders that treated resistance to imperial financial demands as equivalent to armed rebellion, justifying the use of lethal force against tribal leaders who attempted to protect their people's property. The transformation of Roman soldiers from protectors of imperial subjects into agents of systematic robbery fundamentally altered the relationship between occupying forces and native populations throughout Britain. The psychological impact of these events on Iceni society extended far beyond the immediate material losses inflicted by Roman confiscation policies. The public humiliation of their queen and the sexual violence against royal daughters struck at fundamental assumptions about social order, divine protection, and tribal continuity that had sustained Iceni identity for centuries. Celtic religious beliefs emphasized the sacred nature of royal authority and the divine protection afforded to legitimate rulers, making the Roman assault on Boudica's family a theological as well as political crisis. The failure of traditional gods to protect their chosen representatives suggested either divine abandonment or the need for dramatic action to restore proper relationships between the human and supernatural worlds. The destruction of Iceni political institutions proceeded simultaneously with the seizure of material wealth, as Roman administrators systematically dismantled the governmental structures that had maintained tribal unity and identity. Traditional assemblies were dissolved, legal procedures were replaced with Roman administrative practices, and the complex networks of kinship and clientage that had bound the tribe together were disrupted through the removal of key leaders. This institutional destruction aimed to prevent organised resistance while facilitating the integration of former Iceni territory into standard provincial administration. However, The speed and thoroughness of these changes created widespread confusion and resentment among populations who suddenly found themselves without familiar sources of authority or legal protection. The impact on Iceni religious practices proved equally devastating, as Roman officials moved to eliminate potential sources of resistance centered on traditional spiritual beliefs and ceremonial activities. Sacred groves were cut down, ritual sites were abandoned or converted to Roman purposes, and the Druids who had preserved tribal memory and legal traditions faced systematic persecution. The disruption of seasonal festivals and ceremonial cycles that had regulated agricultural and social activities created additional disorientation among populations already struggling to adapt to new political and economic realities. The attack on Celtic religious traditions represented a fundamental assault on tribal identity that many Iceni viewed as requiring divine retribution through military action. The response of other British tribes to the events in Iceni territory reveals the broader pattern of Roman exploitation that had created resentment throughout the province. The Trinovantes, whose lands had been systematically confiscated to benefit Roman colonial veterans, recognised in Iceni suffering a preview of their own likely fate under continued imperial rule. Smaller tribal groups that had maintained nominal independence through client arrangements understood that Prasutagus' death demonstrated the ultimate futility of accommodation with Roman demands. The systematic nature of Roman exploitation had created conditions for intertribal cooperation that transcended traditional rivalries and territorial disputes, providing the foundation for the coalition that would soon rally to Boudica's leadership. The transformation of Boudica from grieving widow to revolutionary leader occurred within this context of systematic brutalization and institutional destruction that left her people with no alternatives to armed resistance. The legal channels through which Celtic leaders had previously sought redress for grievances had been eliminated, along with the client kingdom system that had provided mechanisms for negotiation and compromise. Roman officials had demonstrated through their treatment of the Iceni royal family that they viewed Celtic leaders as obstacles to be eliminated rather than partners to be accommodated. The choice facing Boudica and her people had been reduced to submission and cultural extinction or rebellion, and the possibility of restoring their independence through military victory. The systematic brutalization of the Iceni royal family catalysed a transformation in Boudica that would reshape the political landscape of Roman Britain. The woman who had once navigated the delicate balance between Celtic tradition and imperial accommodation now faced a reality where such diplomatic solutions had become impossible. Roman actions had eliminated every legal avenue for redress, while demonstrating that accommodation with imperial authority offered no protection against systematic exploitation and cultural destruction. The physical wounds from her public flogging would heal, but the psychological impact of witnessing her daughter's violation and her people's humiliation created a revolutionary leader whose rage would soon ignite the most serious challenge to Roman rule in Britain's history. Archaeological evidence from Iceni territory during the months following Prasutagus' death reveals the material conditions that shaped Boudica's transformation from queen consort to war leader. Excavations at major settlements show signs of hasty abandonment, with valuable objects buried in carefully concealed hoards that suggest systematic preparation for conflict. The distribution of these deposits across East Anglia indicates coordinated planning rather than random panic, as tribal leaders positioned resources to support extended military operations while denying them to Roman confiscation efforts. The discovery of weapons caches at sites throughout Norfolk and Suffolk demonstrates that military preparations began almost immediately after the initial Roman seizures, with smiths working frantically to produce spearheads, sword blades and arrowheads for the coming confrontation. The process of rallying the Iceni tribe required Boudica to overcome traditional Celtic political structures that emphasise consensus building and collective decision-making rather than individual authority. Celtic leadership typically emerged through complex negotiations among warrior bands, kinship groups, and territorial divisions, with successful leaders demonstrating their worthiness through prowess in battle, wisdom in council, and generosity in redistributing wealth. Boudica's position as widow of the former king provided some legitimacy, but Celtic succession practices required active demonstration of leadership capabilities rather than passive inheritance of authority. Her ability to transform personal grievance into tribal cause depended on convincing diverse Iceni factions that Roman actions threatened not merely the royal family, but the entire foundation of their society. The religious dimensions of Boudica's emergence as a war leader drew upon deep-seated Celtic beliefs about divine sanction for military action and the sacred nature of resistance to foreign domination. Celtic warfare traditions emphasise the importance of supernatural approval for major military undertakings, with druids interpreting omens, conducting sacrificial rituals, and invoking divine protection for warriors preparing for battle. Boudica's public humiliation and her daughter's violation provided powerful symbolic evidence of divine displeasure with Roman rule, as traditional Celtic theology interpreted such disasters as signs that the gods demanded action to restore proper cosmic order. Her transformation from victim to avenger allowed her to present herself as an instrument of divine justice, rather than merely a grieving mother seeking personal revenge. The specific religious symbolism that Boudica employed during her rise to leadership reveals sophisticated understanding of Celtic mythological traditions that associated female deities with warfare, sovereignty, and territorial protection. Archaeological evidence from pre-Roman Britain includes numerous depictions of warrior goddesses who combined maternal and martial aspects, protecting tribal territories while inspiring warriors to extraordinary feats of courage. These divine figures typically appeared during times of crisis to lead their people against foreign invaders, offering both supernatural assistance and moral justification for resistance to external authority. Boudica's adoption of similar symbolism allowed her to present her rebellion as fulfillment of ancient prophecies rather than desperate response to immediate circumstances. The process of building support among Iceni warrior bands required careful attention to traditional Celtic military customs that emphasized personal loyalty, honor codes, and reciprocal obligations between leaders and followers. Celtic warriors expected their leaders to demonstrate courage in battle, generosity in distributing spoils, and loyalty to their followers' welfare in exchange for military service and personal devotion. Boudica's ability to inspire such loyalty, despite her lack of previous military command, suggests exceptional charismatic abilities combined with deep understanding of warrior psychology and Celtic martial traditions. Her success in uniting traditionally fractious tribal factions indicates sophisticated political skills that transcended conventional gender expectations and established her authority through demonstrated competence rather than inherited status. The expansion of Boudica's coalition beyond the Iceni tribe required even more complex diplomatic negotiations with leaders who had their own grievances against Roman rule but also their own territorial ambitions and tribal rivalries. The Trinovantes, whose lands around Camulodunum had been systematically confiscated for Roman colonial settlement, represented the most natural allies for Iceni rebellion. Their population had endured years of displacement, cultural suppression, and economic exploitation that created widespread resentment against imperial authority. However, traditional hostilities between the Iceni and Trinovantes, rooted in centuries of territorial disputes and cattle raiding, required careful management to prevent ancient rivalries from undermining the anti-Roman coalition. Archaeological discoveries from Trinovantian territory reveal the material conditions that made this tribe receptive to Boudica's revolutionary message. Excavations at sites throughout Essex show evidence of systematic destruction and abandonment during the 50s AD. As Roman colonial expansion displaced native populations, and appropriated their agricultural lands. The famous Lexden tumulus, a massive burial mound that may have contained the remains of Cunobalin, shows signs of deliberate desecration during this period, suggesting Roman efforts to eliminate symbols of Celtic royal authority and tribal identity. These archaeological traces provide physical evidence of the cultural destruction that motivated Trinovantian participation in Boudica's rebellion, while demonstrating the systematic nature of Roman colonial exploitation throughout southeastern Britain. The religious appeal of Boudica's movement among the Trinovantes drew particular strength from shared opposition to Roman interference with traditional Celtic spiritual practices. The establishment of the Temple of Claudius at Camulodunum represented a direct challenge to Celtic religious autonomy, as imperial cult worship required participation from tribal leaders who viewed such ceremonies as betrayal of ancestral gods and cultural traditions. The temple complex constructed on the site of Cunobalin's former capital symbolized Roman replacement of Celtic political and religious authority with imperial institutions that demanded absolute loyalty from conquered populations. The forced participation of tribal elites in imperial cult ceremonies created particularly intense resentment among populations who viewed such requirements as spiritual contamination and cultural suicide. The expansion of Boudica's coalition to include smaller tribal groups and sub-tribal factions required different diplomatic approaches tailored to each group's specific circumstances and grievances. The Coincidental, whose territory extended across the East Midlands, had maintained nominal independence through client arrangements similar to those of the Iceni, but faced increasing Roman pressure for military recruitment and resource extraction. Segments of this tribe, particularly those in areas closest to Roman military installations, had experienced the same pattern of systematic exploitation that had devastated Iceni society. Boudica's agents worked to convince Coincidental leaders that accommodation with Roman demands offered no long-term security, and that only coordinated resistance could preserve tribal autonomy and cultural identity. The timing of Boudica's rebellion demonstrated sophisticated strategic thinking that took advantage of Roman military dispositions and imperial political circumstances. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had committed the bulk of Britain's legionary forces to a major campaign against the Druids on Mona, leaving the province's eastern regions defended only by auxiliary units and colonial militias of questionable reliability. The attack on Mona represented the culmination of Roman efforts to eliminate Druidical influence throughout Britain, as imperial administrators recognised the Druids' role in maintaining Celtic cultural resistance and coordinating opposition to Roman rule. The concentration of military resources on this distant campaign created a strategic opportunity that Boudica and her advisors recognised and exploited with remarkable effectiveness. The religious significance of the Roman assault on Mona provided additional motivation for Celtic tribes throughout Britain to support Boudica's rebellion. Anglesey had served for centuries as the principal centre of Druidical learning and Celtic religious authority, attracting students and pilgrims from across the Celtic world. The island's sacred groves contained the most important shrines and ritual sites in British Celtic religion, while its druids preserved the oral traditions that maintained tribal laws, genealogies, and cultural practices. The Roman decision to destroy these religious centres represented a fundamental assault on Celtic civilization that transcended tribal boundaries and created shared motivation for resistance among populations who might otherwise have remained neutral in purely political conflicts. The practical challenges of coordinating rebellion among multiple tribes required sophisticated communication networks and logistical planning that drew upon existing Celtic trade relationships and kinship connections. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Roman Britain possessed well-developed road systems and river transport networks that facilitated regular communication between tribal territories. These existing infrastructure systems provided the foundation for rebel coordination while allowing Boudica's agents to move between tribal territories without attracting Roman attention. The use of traditional Celtic festivals and religious gatherings as cover for military planning allowed rebel leaders to coordinate their activities while maintaining the appearance of normal cultural practices. The military preparations for rebellion required careful attention to Celtic warfare traditions that emphasized mobility, surprise attacks, and psychological warfare, rather than the disciplined formations and siege techniques that characterized Roman military practice. Celtic armies typically consisted of warrior bands organized around kinship groups and personal loyalty networks, with individual combat skills and heroic leadership playing crucial roles in determining battlefield outcomes. Boudica's forces would need to exploit Roman tactical weaknesses while avoiding direct confrontation with disciplined legionary formations that could neutralize Celtic advantages in mobility and individual fighting prowess. The successful coordination of multiple tribal contingents required adaptation of traditional Celtic military customs to accommodate larger-scale operations than individual tribes typically conducted. The symbolic importance of Boudica's personal transformation from victim to avenger provided crucial psychological momentum for the developing rebellion. Celtic culture emphasized the importance of personal honor and the obligation to seek vengeance for injuries inflicted upon family members and tribal communities. Boudica's public humiliation and her daughter's violation created clear moral imperatives for action that transcended political calculations and appeal to fundamental Celtic concepts of justice and social obligation. Her transformation from grieving widow to implacable war leader provided a powerful narrative that inspired supporters while demonstrating the personal stakes involved in the struggle against Roman domination. The practical aspects of mobilizing tribal resources for extended military operations required careful management of agricultural cycles, livestock herds, and craft production that supported Celtic society. The rebellion would need to be timed to minimize disruption to essential economic activities, while ensuring adequate supplies for military campaigns that might extend over multiple seasons. Archaeological evidence suggests that Celtic communities maintained substantial food reserves and possessed sophisticated knowledge of seasonal patterns that could be exploited to support military operations. The coordination of these logistical requirements across multiple tribal territories represented a significant organizational challenge that required detailed planning and extensive cooperation among traditionally independent communities. The development of intelligence networks to monitor Roman military movements and administrative activities required exploitation of existing relationships between Celtic communities and Roman installations throughout the province. Many Britons served in auxiliary military units or worked in civilian capacities for Roman administrators, providing potential sources of information about imperial plans and military dispositions. However, the recruitment of such intelligence sources required careful assessment of individual loyalties and motivations, as discovery of rebel sympathizers within Roman service could compromise the entire rebellion. The successful penetration of Roman administrative and military structures demonstrates sophisticated understanding of imperial organizational weaknesses and the persistent strength of tribal loyalties despite years of Roman cultural pressure. The selection of Camulodunum as the rebellion's first target demonstrated Boudica's sophisticated understanding of both military strategy and psychological warfare. The former Trinovantian capital had undergone systematic transformation since the Roman conquest, evolving from a Celtic oppidum into the province's premier colonial settlement and administrative centre. The city's symbolic importance extended far beyond its immediate military value, as Camulodunum represented the physical manifestation of Roman imperial authority in Britain. Its destruction would send shockwaves throughout the province, while providing concrete proof that Roman power could be challenged and defeated by coordinated Celtic resistance. The strategic advantages of attacking Camulodunum first became apparent through careful analysis of Roman military dispositions across Britain during the spring of 60 AD. Governor Suetonius Paulinus had committed the Titingemina and Valeria Victrix legions to his campaign against the Druids on Mona, while the Tuan Augusta remained stationed in the west to secure recently conquered territories in Wales. The Nith Hispana, normally responsible for defending the eastern regions, had advanced northward to support operations against the Brigantes, leaving Camulodunum defended only by colonial veterans and auxiliary units of questionable combat effectiveness. This temporary weakness in Roman defences created a strategic opportunity that Boudica's military advisors recognised and exploited with devastating efficiency. Archaeological evidence from pre-rebellion Camulodunum reveals the extent of Roman transformation that had occurred since Claudius's triumph in 49 AD. Excavations throughout modern Colchester have uncovered the remains of substantial Roman public buildings, residential districts, and commercial areas that had replaced the original Celtic settlement. The colonial veterans who formed the city's core population had received generous land grants, carved from Trinovantian territory, creating a prosperous community that served as a showcase for Roman civilization, while providing a strategic reserve of experienced soldiers to maintain imperial control over southeastern Britain. The wealth accumulated by these colonists through agricultural exploitation and commercial activities made Camulodunum an attractive target for rebel forces seeking to finance extended military operations. The religious significance of Camulodunum within the Roman imperial system added crucial symbolic dimensions to Boudica's strategic calculations. The Temple of Claudius, constructed during the 50s AD, represented the first major imperial cult centre established in Britain and served as the focal point for mandatory religious observances that demonstrated provincial loyalty to imperial authority. The temple's imposing architecture, built in classical Roman style with massive stone columns and elaborate decorative elements, created a physical symbol of imperial permanence that dominated the city's skyline. Its destruction would demonstrate that Roman religious authority, like Roman military power, could be challenged and defeated by determined Celtic resistance. The forced participation of tribal elites in imperial cult ceremonies at the Temple of Claudius had created particularly intense resentment among Celtic populations who viewed such requirements as spiritual contamination and cultural betrayal. Archaeological discoveries of ritual deposits from pre-Roman sites throughout Essex suggest the continuing strength of traditional Celtic religious practices, despite official pressure for conversion to Roman cults. The temple's location on the site of Cunobelin's former royal residence added additional insult to injury, as Roman authorities had deliberately chosen to build their religious centre on ground sacred to Celtic royal tradition. This systematic replacement of Celtic sacred space with Roman religious architecture represented a fundamental assault on tribal identity that many Britons viewed as requiring divine retribution. The practical challenges of coordinating a surprise attack on Camulodunum required careful exploitation of existing trade relationships and communication networks that connected Celtic communities throughout southeastern Britain. Archaeological evidence suggests that pre-Roman Britain possessed well-developed commercial systems that facilitated regular movement of people and goods between tribal territories. These existing networks provided cover for rebel agents who gathered intelligence about Roman military dispositions while coordinating the timing of simultaneous uprisings across multiple tribal areas. The successful synchronization of Iceni, Trinovantian, and other tribal contingents demonstrates sophisticated logistical planning that drew upon traditional Celtic organizational capabilities while adapting them to unprecedented military requirements. The approach to Camulodunum revealed the tactical advantages that Celtic forces possessed when operating on familiar terrain against enemies unprepared for coordinated resistance. Boudica's army advanced through countryside that had remained largely unchanged despite Roman administrative control, utilising ancient trackways and river crossings that Celtic warriors had known since childhood. The rebels moved primarily at night and during periods of poor weather that reduced visibility while exploiting their superior knowledge of local geography to avoid Roman patrols and observation posts. This intimate familiarity with the landscape allowed Celtic forces to achieve complete tactical surprise while positioning themselves for coordinated attacks from multiple directions. The composition of Boudica's army as it approached Camulodunum reflected the successful expansion of her coalition beyond the original Iceni tribal base. Archaeological analysis of weapon types and decorative styles found at battlefield sites suggests the presence of warriors from at least 6 different tribal groups, each contributing specialized military capabilities to the rebel force. Iceni cavalry provided mobility and reconnaissance capabilities, while Trinovantian infantry brought intimate knowledge of Camulodunum's defences and the locations of key targets within the city. Smaller tribal contingents contributed archers, slingers, and specialists in siege warfare, who possessed knowledge of Roman defensive techniques gained through service in auxiliary units. The initial assault on Camulodunum's outer defences exploited fundamental weaknesses in Roman colonial military organisation that reflected overconfidence in imperial superiority and inadequate preparation for coordinated native resistance. The city's fortifications had been designed primarily to impress visitors and demonstrate Roman engineering capabilities rather than to withstand serious military assault. Archaeological excavations have revealed defensive walls of modest height and thickness, with gates positioned for administrative convenience rather than military security. The colonial veterans responsible for the city's defence had grown complacent during nearly 2 decades of peaceful occupation, while their weapons and armour had deteriorated through lack of maintenance and regular training. The psychological impact of the rebels' sudden appearance outside Camulodunum created panic among the Roman population that contributed significantly to the city's rapid collapse. Colonial veterans who had spent years treating native Britons with contempt suddenly found themselves facing thousands of armed Celtic warriors whose war cries and battle standards evoked memories of earlier campaigns against unconquered tribes. The sight of Boudica herself, described by contemporary sources as a figure of imposing physical presence with flowing red hair and a powerful voice that could be heard across the battlefield, provided a focal point for Celtic morale while symbolising the transformation of Roman victims into implacable enemies. The systematic destruction of Roman administrative buildings during the assault on Camulodunum reflected deliberate strategic planning, rather than random violence driven purely by revenge or bloodlust. Rebel forces targeted specific structures that represented different aspects of Roman imperial authority, beginning with the basilica that housed the colonial government and law courts, where Roman legal procedures had replaced traditional Celtic dispute resolution mechanisms. The destruction of official records, legal documents, and administrative archives eliminated the bureaucratic infrastructure that had facilitated Roman control while symbolically rejecting the legitimacy of imperial legal authority over Celtic populations. The assault on the Temple of Claudius represented the rebellion's most symbolically significant action, as the destruction of this imperial cult centre demonstrated Celtic rejection of Roman religious authority and divine claims to universal dominion. Archaeological evidence suggests that the temple's destruction involved systematic dismantling rather than simple burning, with rebel forces taking time to remove valuable materials and decorative elements that could be repurposed for Celtic religious sites or melted down to finance continued military operations. The careful removal of imperial statuary and religious artefacts allowed rebels to conduct ritual desecration ceremonies that inverted Roman religious symbolism while asserting the superior power of Celtic deities. The massacre of Roman colonists and their families during Camulodunum's fall reflected the intensity of accumulated resentment against populations who had directly benefited from Celtic dispossession and cultural suppression. Contemporary Roman sources describe systematic killing that targeted not only military personnel, but also civilian settlers whose presence represented the permanence of imperial occupation. Archaeological evidence from mass burial sites suggests that the violence, while extensive, followed certain patterns that may have reflected Celtic legal traditions regarding punishment for territorial violations and cultural crimes. The rebels' treatment of Roman prisoners appears to have included ritual elements that drew upon traditional Celtic concepts of divine justice and supernatural retribution. The looting of Camulodunum provided Boudica's forces with substantial material resources that would prove crucial for sustaining extended military operations against Roman counterattacks. The city's warehouses contained accumulated wealth from 2 decades of colonial exploitation, including precious metals, manufactured goods, and agricultural surpluses that represented the concentrated profits of systematic resource extraction from Celtic territories. Archaeological discoveries of hastily buried treasure hoards throughout the city suggest that some Romans had advance warning of the attack and attempted to protect their valuables, but the speed and thoroughness of the rebel assault prevented most such efforts from succeeding. The capture of Roman military equipment and supplies during Camulodunum's fall provided Celtic forces with access to weapons and armour that significantly enhanced their combat capabilities against disciplined legionary formations. The colonial veterans' armouries contained substantial quantities of standardised Roman military gear, including iron swords, javelins, shields, and protective armour that Celtic smiths could adapt for use by tribal warriors. More importantly, the rebels acquired siege equipment and engineering tools that would prove valuable in future operations against fortified Roman positions. The integration of Roman military technology with traditional Celtic fighting techniques created hybrid tactical approaches that would prove surprisingly effective against imperial forces unprepared for such innovations. The destruction of Camulodunum's commercial infrastructure eliminated a crucial link in the economic networks that had facilitated Roman exploitation of British resources while generating profits for imperial merchants and administrators. The city had served as a major centre for processing and exporting British agricultural products, minerals, and manufactured goods to continental markets, with its destruction disrupting trade relationships that extended throughout the Roman Empire. Archaeological evidence from commercial buildings shows systematic destruction of workshops, storage facilities, and transport equipment that would have required years to rebuild even if Roman forces succeeded in recapturing the city. The psychological impact of Camulodunum's destruction on Roman confidence throughout Britain extended far beyond the immediate military significance of losing a single city. The colonial capital had represented Roman claims to permanent dominion over conquered British territories, with its impressive public buildings and prosperous population serving as visible proof of imperial civilization's superiority over Celtic barbarism. News of the city's complete destruction and the massacre of its Roman inhabitants shattered assumptions about imperial invincibility, while demonstrating that coordinated Celtic resistance could achieve decisive victories against Roman forces. The effect on Celtic morale throughout Britain proved equally dramatic, as news of Boudica's victory spread through existing tribal communication networks and inspired previously neutral populations to join the rebellion. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout eastern England shows signs of hasty abandonment by Roman officials and colonists who fled westward toward areas still under secure imperial control. The sudden collapse of Roman administrative authority in large areas of southeastern Britain created a power vacuum that allowed tribal leaders to reassert traditional governmental structures while coordinating their military efforts with Boudica's expanding coalition. The religious dimensions of Camulodunum's destruction resonated throughout Celtic Britain as evidence that traditional gods had not abandoned their people despite years of Roman cultural suppression and religious persecution. The successful assault on the Temple of Claudius demonstrated that Roman deities possessed no special power to protect their worshippers, while the rebels' victory suggested divine approval for Celtic resistance to imperial authority. Archaeological discoveries of ritual deposits from this period show increased activity at traditional Celtic sacred sites, indicating renewed confidence in ancestral religious practices and growing rejection of Roman cultural assimilation. The strategic implications of controlling Camulodunum extended beyond its immediate symbolic value to include practical advantages for sustaining and expanding the rebellion against Roman counterattacks. The city's location at the confluence of several major river systems provided access to transportation networks that could facilitate rapid movement of troops and supplies throughout southeastern Britain. Its substantial granaries and food storage facilities offered logistical support for maintaining large military forces in the field, while its workshops and craft facilities could be converted to produce weapons and equipment for expanding rebel armies. The capture of such a major population centre also provided a base for recruiting additional warriors from previously neutral tribal groups who might be persuaded to join the rebellion's expanding coalition. The momentum generated by Camulodunum's destruction propelled Boudica's forces toward their next objective with unprecedented confidence and strategic clarity. Intelligence gathered from fleeing Roman colonists and captured administrative documents revealed that Londinium, though lacking the symbolic significance of the former colonial capital, had emerged as the province's primary commercial hub and unofficial administrative centre. The settlement's rapid growth during the preceding decade had transformed it from a modest trading post into a bustling port city that served as the nexus for Roman economic exploitation of British resources. Its warehouses contained accumulated wealth from across the province, while its position on the Thames provided crucial access to continental trade networks that sustained imperial control over Britain. Governor Suetonius Paulinus received news of Camulodunum's fall, while his legions remained committed to operations on Mona, creating an immediate strategic dilemma that would determine the rebellion's ultimate trajectory. The destruction of the colonial capital and massacre of its Roman population demanded immediate military response to prevent the uprising from spreading throughout the province. Yet withdrawing forces from Anglesey would abandon the systematic campaign against Druidical resistance that represented years of careful planning and substantial resource investment. Archaeological evidence from Mona suggests that Roman forces had achieved significant success in destroying Celtic sacred sites and eliminating Druidical leadership, making the timing of Boudica's rebellion particularly problematic for imperial strategic objectives. The governor's decision to abandon the Mona campaign and march eastward with a hastily assembled force demonstrates the severity of the crisis facing Roman authority in Britain. Suetonius departed Anglesey with portions of the 14th Gemina and Valeria Victrix legions, leaving behind substantial equipment and supplies in his urgency to respond to the rebellion. Archaeological discoveries on Anglesey include Roman military gear and construction materials abandoned during this hasty withdrawal, suggesting that imperial forces sacrificed months of logistical preparation to address the immediate threat posed by Boudica's expanding coalition. The governor's rapid movement across Wales and into the English Midlands required forced marches that tested his troops' endurance, while providing limited time for gathering intelligence about rebel strength and dispositions. Meanwhile, Boudica's army had swollen to enormous proportions as news of Camulodunum's destruction inspired previously neutral tribes and sub-tribal groups to join the rebellion. Contemporary Roman estimates suggest that her forces may have numbered over 100,000 warriors, though such figures likely included non-combatants and camp followers who accompanied Celtic armies according to traditional practices. Archaeological analysis of temporary encampments along the rebels' route of march reveals evidence of massive logistical operations that supported this unprecedented concentration of Celtic military power. The discovery of temporary smithies, food preparation areas, and livestock pens indicates sophisticated organisational capabilities that enabled Boudica's coalition to maintain cohesion while advancing rapidly toward their next objectives. The approach to Londinium revealed fundamental differences between this target and the previous assault on Camulodunum that would significantly influence rebel tactical planning and strategic objectives. Unlike the former colonial capital with its established defences and veteran population, Londinium remained essentially an unfortified commercial settlement whose inhabitants possessed limited military experience or defensive capabilities. The city's rapid growth had attracted merchants, craftsmen and administrators from throughout the empire, creating a cosmopolitan population that included substantial numbers of Gallic and Germanic immigrants alongside Roman citizens and Romanized Britons. This diverse demographic composition presented both opportunities and challenges for rebel forces whose primary motivations centred on expelling Roman authority from British soil. Intelligence gathered by Boudica's scouts revealed that Londinium's defences consisted primarily of a modest earthwork perimeter, punctuated by wooden palisades that had been constructed more to define the settlement's boundaries than to withstand serious military assault. Archaeological excavations in modern London have uncovered remains of these early defensive works, revealing construction techniques that prioritise speed and economy over military effectiveness. The settlement's location on the Thames provided natural protection from the south, but the river also created potential escape routes for inhabitants who might flee by boat toward Roman-controlled territories in Gaul. The rebels would need to coordinate their assault carefully to prevent the escape of valuable prisoners and portable wealth that could finance continued Roman resistance. The systematic intelligence network that Boudica's forces had developed throughout southeastern Britain provided crucial information about Londinium's economic importance and the location of key targets within the settlement. Celtic agents operating as merchants, labourers and domestic servants had spent months mapping the city's warehouse districts, administrative buildings and residential areas occupied by wealthy Roman officials and merchants. These intelligence operations revealed the locations of major treasure hoards, weapons caches and strategic infrastructure that would require priority attention during the coming assault. The rebels' detailed knowledge of Londinium's internal layout would prove crucial for maximising the destruction, while minimising their own casualties during urban combat operations. Governor Suetonius reached Londinium shortly before Boudica's forces arrived in the vicinity, providing him with a critical opportunity to assess the settlement's defensive capabilities and strategic value. Archaeological evidence suggests that the governor conducted a rapid inspection of the city's fortifications, population, and available military resources before concluding that successful defence would prove impossible with the forces at his disposal. The settlement lacked adequate defensive walls, possessed insufficient military supplies, and contained a population more suited to commercial activities than sustained military resistance. Contemporary sources indicate that Suetonius recognised the futility of attempting to hold Londinium against Boudica's overwhelming numerical superiority, while his main legionary forces remained scattered across Britain. The Roman decision to abandon Londinium without attempting a defence shocked the settlement's inhabitants and revealed the extent to which imperial confidence had been shattered by Camulodunum's destruction. Archaeological discoveries from hasty abandonment layers throughout London show evidence of panicked flight, with valuable items left behind by residents who prioritise speed over material possessions in their desperate attempts to reach safety. The governor's withdrawal with his limited military escort eliminated any possibility of organised resistance while creating a power vacuum that rebel forces could exploit without significant opposition. This strategic abandonment represented a calculated decision to preserve Roman military strength for future operations rather than sacrifice limited resources in a hopeless defensive battle. The civilian population's response to news of the impending abandonment created chaotic scenes throughout Londinium as residents attempted to flee with whatever possessions they could carry. Contemporary accounts describe desperate attempts to secure river transport, with boat owners demanding enormous payments for passage to Gallic ports, where refugees might find safety under continued Roman protection. Archaeological evidence from riverside areas shows signs of hasty construction of additional watercraft, suggesting that some residents attempted to build their own vessels rather than rely on existing commercial shipping. The inadequate transportation capacity forced many inhabitants to remain in the city despite their desire to escape, creating a substantial population of potential victims for the approaching rebel forces. Boudica's army approached Londinium from multiple directions, with different tribal contingents coordinating their movements to surround the settlement and prevent organised resistance or mass evacuation. The rebels' tactical deployment reflected lessons learned during the assault on Camulodunum, particularly the importance of controlling escape routes and maintaining pressure on multiple fronts simultaneously. Archaeological analysis of temporary fortifications constructed during this period suggests that Celtic forces had adapted Roman siege techniques to their own purposes, creating coordinated investment of the target that prevented relief operations while facilitating systematic destruction of specific objectives within the settlement. The initial assault on Londinium began before dawn, with coordinated attacks against the settlement's modest perimeter defences, which collapsed almost immediately under pressure from thousands of Celtic warriors whose battle cries shattered the morning silence. Archaeological evidence from defensive positions shows signs of brief but intense combat, with weapon fragments and human remains indicating that some Roman auxiliaries and civilian volunteers attempted to resist the rebel advance. However, the overwhelming numerical superiority of Boudica's forces, combined with their high morale following the Camulodunum victory, quickly overcame all organised resistance and opened the settlement to systematic occupation and destruction. The systematic burning of Londinium created an archaeological signature that remains visible in modern London excavations as a distinctive layer of ash, charcoal, and fire-damaged artefacts that archaeologists term the Boudican destruction horizon. This layer extends throughout the ancient settlement area, indicating that the rebels conducted comprehensive destruction rather than limiting their attention to specific targets or districts. Scientific analysis of the burning debris reveals evidence of intense fires that reached temperatures sufficient to melt bronze objects and crack stone foundations, suggesting that the rebels used accelerants and systematic fire-setting techniques to ensure complete destruction of Roman infrastructure and commercial facilities. The targeting priorities during Londinium's destruction reflected strategic thinking that extended beyond simple revenge to encompass systematic elimination of Roman economic and administrative capabilities. Rebel forces concentrated their initial efforts on the settlement's warehouse districts, where accumulated wealth from throughout the province had been stored awaiting shipment to continental markets. Archaeological excavations in these areas have revealed melted coins, destroyed trade goods, and burned account records that represented the concentrated profits of Roman exploitation of British resources. The systematic destruction of these commercial facilities eliminated crucial infrastructure while providing rebels with portable wealth that could finance continued military operations. The assault on Londinium's administrative buildings targeted the bureaucratic apparatus that had facilitated Roman control over British tribal territories through legal manipulation, taxation, and systematic record-keeping. Archaeological discoveries include destroyed archives containing land records, tax assessments, and legal documents that had been used to justify confiscation of Celtic property and imposition of imperial administrative control. The elimination of these records represented more than symbolic victory. It created practical obstacles to Roman efforts to reassert administrative authority over territories that had been incorporated into the provincial system through complex legal procedures that would be difficult to reconstruct without documentary evidence. The treatment of Londinium's civilian population during the rebellion revealed the intensity of accumulated resentment against all representatives of Roman authority and cultural influence in Britain. Contemporary sources described systematic killing that targeted not only Roman citizens, but also Romanized Britons and foreign merchants whose presence supported imperial economic exploitation of the province. Archaeological evidence from mass burial sites suggests that the violence followed patterns similar to those observed at Camulodunum, with rebels conducting what they apparently viewed as judicial executions rather than random massacre. The systematic nature of these killings indicates deliberate policy decisions rather than spontaneous violence driven purely by battlefield emotions. The religious dimensions of Londinium's destruction included systematic desecration of Roman temples and shrines that had been established to serve the settlement's diverse population. Archaeological discoveries revealed deliberate destruction of religious statuary, altars, and votive offerings that represented various Mediterranean cults and imperial religious practices. The rebels' treatment of these religious sites reflected broader Celtic rejection of Roman spiritual authority, while asserting the superior power of traditional British deities. Evidence suggests that some destruction involved ritual elements that drew upon Celtic religious traditions regarding the proper treatment of conquered enemies and foreign religious practices. The looting of Londinium provided Boudica's forces with enormous quantities of portable wealth that significantly enhanced their ability to sustain extended military operations and attract additional tribal support. The settlement's role as a commercial hub had concentrated valuable goods from throughout the Roman Empire, including precious metals, manufactured items, and exotic materials that represented substantial accumulated capital. Archaeological analysis of abandoned hoards suggests that some merchants attempted to hide their most valuable possessions, but the thoroughness of the rebel occupation made most such efforts unsuccessful. The captured wealth provided resources for purchasing additional weapons, supplies, and services, while offering tangible rewards that helped maintain coalition unity among diverse tribal groups. The destruction of Londinium's port facilities eliminated crucial infrastructure that had facilitated Roman control over British trade relationships and resource extraction. Archaeological excavations along the Thames have revealed systematic destruction of wharves, warehouses, and shipping facilities that had been constructed to handle the increasing volume of commerce between Britain and continental markets. The rebels' attention to these maritime installations reflected understanding of their strategic importance in maintaining Roman economic control over the province. The elimination of port facilities would create lasting obstacles to imperial efforts to restore commercial relationships even after military control had been re-established. News of Londinium's destruction spread rapidly throughout Britain and reached continental Roman territories within days of the settlement's fall, creating widespread alarm about the rebellion's scope and intensity. Archaeological evidence from Gallic ports shows signs of increased military activity during this period, suggesting that imperial authorities began preparing defensive measures against possible rebel expansion across the English Channel. The psychological impact of losing two major settlements within weeks demonstrated that Boudica's rebellion represented a fundamental challenge to Roman authority, rather than a localized uprising that could be contained through routine military operations. The strategic implications of controlling both Camulodunum and Londinium provided Boudica's coalition with unprecedented leverage over Roman positions throughout southeastern Britain. The rebels now controlled the two most important urban centres in the province while possessing the logistical resources necessary to sustain large military forces for extended periods. Archaeological evidence from this period shows signs of systematic organisation within rebel-controlled territories, with temporary administrative structures established to coordinate military operations and distribute captured resources among participating tribal groups. The successful coordination of such complex operations demonstrated organisational capabilities that Roman officials had not anticipated among Celtic populations. The momentum generated by these successive victories propelled Boudica's forces toward their next major objective, Verulamium, the principal settlement of the Catuvalauni and another symbol of Roman cultural transformation in Britain. The city's significance extended beyond its immediate strategic value to encompass its role as a showcase for Roman municipal government and urban planning that had been imposed upon traditional Celtic territorial organisation. Archaeological evidence from Verulamium reveals extensive Roman architectural development during the preceding 2 decades, including public buildings, residential districts, and commercial areas that represented successful integration of Celtic populations into imperial urban culture. The approach to Verulamium required different tactical considerations than the previous assaults, as this settlement possessed more substantial defences and a population that included significant numbers of Romanised Britons who might offer organised resistance to rebel forces. Archaeological excavations have revealed defensive earthworks and stone fortifications that represented more serious military obstacles than those encountered at either Camulodunum or Londinium. The city's location on elevated ground provided natural defensive advantages, while its proximity to major road networks offered potential escape routes for inhabitants seeking to reach Roman military installations in the western regions of the province. The systematic destruction of Verulamium followed patterns established during the previous assaults, but adapted to address the specific characteristics of this target and its population. Archaeological evidence reveals comprehensive burning that created another distinctive destruction layer, visible in modern excavations throughout St Albans. The intensity and extent of the destruction suggests that rebel forces had refined their techniques for systematic urban demolition, while maintaining the organisational discipline necessary to coordinate complex operations across multiple tribal contingents. The successful assault on Verulamium demonstrated that Boudica's coalition had evolved from a spontaneous uprising into a sophisticated military organisation capable of sustained campaign operations against diverse types of Roman installations. The elimination of Verulamium's Romanised British population represented a particularly significant aspect of the rebellion's evolving character, as these individuals had voluntarily adopted Roman cultural practices and municipal institutions rather than having them imposed through conquest. Archaeological discoveries suggest that the rebels made little distinction between Roman colonists and Romanised natives, treating both groups as representatives of imperial authority that required elimination. This systematic targeting of cultural collaborators reflected the rebellion's evolution from resistance against specific Roman policies toward comprehensive rejection of imperial civilization and all forms of accommodation with Roman authority. The systematic destruction of 3 major Roman settlements had transformed Boudica from a grieving widow into the most formidable enemy the empire had faced in Britain since the initial conquest. Her coalition now controlled vast swaths of southeastern England, while possessing captured resources sufficient to sustain military operations for months. However, the very success of these urban assaults had also provided Governor Suetonius Paulinus with crucial intelligence about rebel capabilities and strategic priorities. The governor's forced marches across Wales had allowed him to observe first-hand the scale of destruction, while gathering scattered Roman forces for a coordinated response that would exploit Celtic tactical weaknesses and Roman military advantages. Archaeological evidence from the governor's route of march reveals the systematic approach that characterised Roman military planning even under crisis conditions. Temporary camps constructed during this period show standardised layouts and defensive features that maintained Roman tactical doctrine despite the urgency of the situation. Supply caches positioned along major roads indicate advanced logistical preparation that enabled sustained movement of legionary forces across difficult terrain. The discovery of message tablets and signal equipment at these sites suggests sophisticated communication networks that allowed Suetonius to coordinate with scattered garrison commanders while gathering intelligence about rebel movements and strategic intentions. The governor's assessment of the strategic situation revealed both opportunities and constraints that would determine his tactical options for confronting Boudica's forces. Roman military strength in Britain had been dispersed across multiple theatres, with significant forces still committed to operations in Wales and northern England that could not be rapidly redeployed without abandoning hard-won territorial gains. The Second Augusta Legion remained stationed in the west under Poenius Postumus, who would controversially refuse orders to join the campaign against Boudica. The Nanin Hispana had suffered severe casualties during an ill-fated attempt to relieve Camulodunum, reducing available legionary strength to portions of 2 understrength legions, plus auxiliary units of varying reliability and combat effectiveness. The intelligence reports reaching Suetonius painted a picture of unprecedented Celtic military organisation that challenged traditional Roman assumptions about barbarian warfare capabilities. Boudica's coalition had demonstrated sophisticated logistical coordination, tactical flexibility, and strategic planning that exceeded anything previously encountered during 2 decades of British campaigns. The rebels had successfully coordinated simultaneous operations across multiple tribal territories while maintaining supply lines that supported forces numbering in the tens of thousands. Their systematic destruction of Roman urban centres revealed understanding of strategic priorities that extended beyond simple revenge to encompass comprehensive elimination of imperial administrative and economic infrastructure. The Roman response required careful balance between immediate tactical necessities and longer-term strategic objectives for maintaining imperial control over Britain. Suetonius recognised that direct confrontation with Boudica's numerically superior forces would require exploitation of Roman advantages in discipline, equipment, and tactical coordination, while negating Celtic strengths in mobility, individual combat skills, and knowledge of local terrain. The governor's military experience in Mauritania had provided familiarity with irregular warfare against tribal coalitions, but the scale and sophistication of Boudica's rebellion exceeded anything he'd previously encountered in provincial campaigns. The selection of a battlefield location became crucial for Roman tactical planning, as Suetonius needed terrain that would channel Celtic numerical superiority into confined spaces where disciplined legionary formations could maximise their combat effectiveness. Archaeological analysis of potential battle sites along Watling Street has identified several locations that match classical descriptions of the final confrontation, with most scholars favouring sites in the West Midlands where the Roman road passed through naturally constricted terrain. The ideal position would provide Roman forces with secure flanks, clear fields of fire for artillery and missile weapons, and natural obstacles that would disrupt Celtic chariot operations while forcing infantry attacks into predetermined killing zones. The debate over the precise battle location reflects broader challenges in reconstructing ancient military operations from limited textual sources and ambiguous archaeological evidence. Tacitus provides the most detailed account but focuses on dramatic narrative rather than specific geographic details that would enable precise identification of the battlefield. Cassius Dio offers additional information, but writing over a century later relied on sources that may have contained inaccuracies or legendary embellishments. Modern archaeological investigations have identified several sites along Watling Street that show evidence of large-scale military activity during the appropriate time period, but definitive identification remains elusive due to subsequent agricultural activity and urban development that have obscured ancient battlefield remains. The Roman tactical deployment reflected lessons learned from previous encounters with Celtic armies while adapting standard legionary formations to address the specific challenges posed by Boudica's coalition. Suetonius positioned his forces in a narrow defile with wooded hills protecting both flanks, creating a funnel effect that would compress Celtic attacks into a relatively confined frontage, where Roman discipline and coordination could prove decisive. Archaeological discoveries of Roman military equipment at potential battle sites include javelin heads, armor fragments, and engineering tools that suggest systematic preparation of defensive positions designed to maximize the effectiveness of coordinated missile fire and disciplined infantry combat. The legionary formations adopted for the battle represented adaptations of traditional Roman tactical doctrine to address the unique characteristics of Celtic warfare and the specific terrain constraints of the chosen battlefield. The front ranks consisted of heavily armoured legionaries equipped with large rectangular shields, short stabbing swords, and javelins designed for close quarters combat against individual Celtic warriors. Behind them, additional ranks provided depth and staying power, while specialised troops, including archers, slingers and artillery crews, prepared to deliver coordinated missile fire that would disrupt Celtic charges before they reached Roman lines. The flanks were secured by auxiliary cavalry units, positioned to exploit any breakthrough opportunities while preventing Celtic forces from outflanking the main Roman position. Boudica's approach to the battlefield revealed the confidence and tactical sophistication that had characterised her previous victories, while also demonstrating the limitations inherent in Celtic military organisation when confronting disciplined Roman formations in prepared positions. Her forces advanced in traditional Celtic fashion, with war chariots leading the assault, followed by masses of infantry organised around tribal and kinship groups rather than standardised military units. The psychological impact of this advance was considerable, with thousands of Celtic warriors creating tremendous noise through war cries, horn blasts, and the thundering of chariot wheels that had previously terrorised Roman opponents in urban combat situations. The Celtic tactical deployment reflected traditional approaches to warfare that emphasised individual heroism, mobility, and psychological intimidation rather than the coordinated manoeuvres that characterised Roman military doctrine. Boudica herself took position at the front of her forces, visible to all participants as she delivered speeches that invoked divine support and reminded her followers of the atrocities that had sparked their rebellion. Contemporary sources describe her appearance during this crucial moment: a tall, imposing figure with flowing red hair, wearing a multicoloured cloak and golden torques that marked her royal status, her voice carrying across the battlefield as she called upon Celtic gods to grant victory over Roman oppressors. The presence of non-combatants among Boudica's forces created both advantages and vulnerabilities that would significantly influence the battle's outcome. Celtic armies traditionally included family members, craftsmen and camp followers who provided logistical support, while serving as witnesses to warrior accomplishments that determined individual status and reputation within tribal society. These civilians had positioned themselves behind the main battle lines in wagons and temporary encampments where they expected to observe another Celtic victory similar to those achieved at Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium. However, their presence also created constraints on Celtic tactical flexibility, while providing potential targets for Roman exploitation if the battle's momentum shifted unexpectedly. The initial phase of combat began with traditional Celtic tactics as war chariots charged toward Roman positions, their crews hurling javelins and shouting challenges while attempting to create gaps in enemy formations that could be exploited by following infantry. Archaeological evidence from similar encounters suggests that these chariot attacks relied on speed and surprise to disrupt enemy cohesion, with individual warriors leaping from their vehicles to engage in personal combat, while drivers manoeuvred to provide support and extraction if necessary. The psychological impact of mass chariot charges had proven effective against poorly disciplined opponents, but Roman legionaries had developed specific techniques for countering such attacks through coordinated defensive measures. The Roman response to the Celtic chariot assault demonstrated the tactical advantages of disciplined formations and coordinated defensive measures against individually brave but poorly coordinated opponents. Legionary front ranks maintained tight shield walls that presented continuous barriers to chariot penetration, while javelin throwers in rear ranks delivered coordinated volleys that targeted chariot crews and horses with devastating effectiveness. The narrow battlefield constrained Celtic maneuverability while channeling their attacks into predetermined killing zones, where Roman advantages in equipment and training could prove decisive. Archaeological discoveries of horse remains and chariot components at potential battle sites suggest that the initial Celtic assaults suffered heavy casualties without achieving significant penetration of Roman defensive positions. The failure of the chariot assault forced Boudica's infantry to advance against prepared Roman positions without the tactical advantages that had characterized their previous urban victories. Celtic foot soldiers found themselves attacking uphill against disciplined formations that had been specifically positioned to maximize Roman defensive capabilities while negating Celtic advantages in individual combat skills and battlefield mobility. The confined terrain prevented the flanking maneuvers and tactical flexibility that had enabled Celtic success in previous encounters, while Roman missile weapons delivered continuous casualties that disrupted Celtic attack formations before they could engage in close combat. The discipline and training advantages that characterized Roman legionary forces became increasingly apparent as the battle progressed, and Celtic numerical superiority failed to achieve decisive results against prepared defensive positions. Roman soldiers had spent years training in coordinated maneuvers that enabled them to maintain formation integrity under combat stress, while delivering systematic offensive and defensive actions that maximized their collective effectiveness. Celtic warriors, despite individual courage and fighting skills, lacked comparable training in large-scale tactical coordination and found themselves unable to exploit their numerical advantages against opponents who fought as integrated units rather than collections of individual combatants. The turning point in the battle occurred when Roman forces transitioned from defensive operations to coordinated offensive action that exploited Celtic tactical vulnerabilities and battlefield positioning. Archaeological evidence suggests that this shift involved systematic advance by legionary formations that maintained disciplined ranks while delivering continuous pressure against Celtic forces that had become disorganized through unsuccessful assault attempts. The Roman advance created psychological as well as tactical momentum, as Celtic warriors who had expected easy victory based on previous successes found themselves facing opponents whose systematic approach to warfare proved superior to traditional Celtic fighting methods. The collapse of Celtic resistance occurred with devastating suddenness, as battlefield momentum shifted decisively in favour of Roman tactical superiority and organisational advantages. Boudica's forces, which had advanced confidently expecting another triumphant victory, found themselves trapped between advancing Roman formations and the non-combatant camps that had been positioned behind their lines. The presence of families and camp followers, which had previously provided psychological support and tactical advantages, now became a catastrophic liability, as fleeing warriors became entangled with civilian crowds that blocked escape routes and created panic throughout the Celtic army. The systematic pursuit that followed the Celtic collapse demonstrated Roman understanding of the psychological and strategic importance of achieving decisive victory that would eliminate the rebellion's leadership while discouraging future resistance. Legionary formations maintained discipline during the pursuit, preventing the random violence that might have allowed significant numbers of Celtic leaders to escape, while ensuring systematic elimination of the rebellion's military capabilities. Archaeological evidence from potential battle sites includes mass burial areas that suggest organised disposal of casualties, rather than the chaotic aftermath typically associated with ancient battles, indicating continued Roman organisational control even during the pursuit phase. The casualties inflicted during the battle and its aftermath effectively eliminated Boudica's coalition as a military force, while demonstrating the ultimate superiority of Roman tactical doctrine over traditional Celtic warfare methods. Contemporary sources suggest that Celtic losses may have exceeded 80,000 killed, though such figures likely include non-combatants and may reflect Roman propaganda rather than accurate casualty counts. Roman losses were reportedly minimal, with Tacitus claiming fewer than 400 killed and wounded among Suetonius's forces. While these figures may be exaggerated to emphasize Roman tactical superiority, the disproportion suggests that disciplined formations and coordinated tactics had achieved decisive advantages over individually brave but poorly organized opponents. The fate of Boudica herself remains one of the most debated aspects of the rebellion's conclusion, with ancient sources providing conflicting accounts that reflect different perspectives on her ultimate destiny. Tacitus reports that she died shortly after the battle, either through suicide by poison to avoid capture, or from illness brought on by the stress and exhaustion of the campaign. Cassius Dio provides a similar account, but with different details about the circumstances of her death. The absence of archaeological evidence for her burial or capture has led to continued speculation about her final fate, with some scholars suggesting that she may have escaped the immediate battlefield, only to die later from wounds or illness in areas not yet investigated by modern archaeologists. The strategic implications of the Roman victory extended far beyond the immediate military results to encompass fundamental questions about the future of Roman rule in Britain and the relationship between imperial authority and native populations. The rebellion had demonstrated both the potential for coordinated Celtic resistance and the ultimate superiority of Roman military organisation when properly deployed against traditional barbarian warfare methods. However, the brutality required to suppress the uprising had also revealed the costs of maintaining imperial control through purely military means, creating long-term challenges for Roman administrators who would need to rebuild relationships with surviving British tribal populations. The aftermath of the battle created immediate administrative challenges for Governor Suetonius as he sought to restore Roman authority while preventing future uprisings through policies that balance punishment with reconciliation. The systematic destruction of 3 major urban centres had eliminated crucial infrastructure, while the rebellion had disrupted trade relationships and agricultural production throughout southeastern Britain. Archaeological evidence from the immediate post-rebellion period shows signs of economic disruption and population displacement that would require years to resolve through systematic reconstruction efforts and careful management of relationships with surviving tribal leaders. The smoke rising from the battlefield along Watling Street marked not merely the end of Boudica's rebellion, but the beginning of a systematic campaign of retribution that would reshape Roman administration throughout Britain. Governor Suetonius Paulinus, his confidence restored by decisive military victory, immediately ordered pursuit operations designed to eliminate surviving rebel leaders while demonstrating imperial power to populations that had either supported the uprising or remained neutral during the crisis. Roman cavalry units fanned out across the countryside, tracking fleeing Celtic warriors to their tribal territories and conducting raids that targeted not only military personnel but entire communities suspected of providing support to the rebellion. The scale of Roman retaliation reflected both military necessity and calculated psychological warfare, designed to prevent future uprisings through systematic terror. Legionary detachments moved methodically through areas that had contributed warriors to Boudica's coalition, burning settlements, confiscating livestock, and executing tribal leaders whose loyalty remained questionable. Archaeological evidence from sites throughout East Anglia and the East Midlands reveals destruction layers dating to this period, with burned roundhouses, scattered metalwork, and hastily buried treasure hoards indicating the systematic nature of Roman punitive operations. The discovery of mass burial sites at several locations suggests that entire communities faced collective punishment for their tribe's participation in the rebellion. The treatment of suspected collaborators extended beyond simple military action to encompass systematic dismantling of traditional Celtic social and political structures that had enabled coordinated resistance. Roman administrators compiled detailed lists of tribal leaders, wealthy landowners, and religious figures who had supported or might potentially support future rebellions. These individuals faced execution, exile, or confiscation of property depending on their perceived level of involvement in anti-Roman activities. Archaeological discoveries of abandoned elite residences throughout former rebel territories indicate that many aristocratic families fled rather than face Roman justice, leaving behind substantial material wealth that was subsequently seized by imperial agents. The systematic confiscation of Celtic property during this retribution phase provided substantial revenues for Roman coffers while eliminating the economic foundation that had enabled tribal independence and military resistance. Imperial agents conducted comprehensive inventories of livestock herds, agricultural lands, craft workshops, and precious metal hoards throughout areas that had supported the rebellion. The famous Snettisham Talks and similar treasure deposits discovered by modern archaeologists likely represent attempts by Celtic families to hide their wealth from Roman confiscation efforts, though the systematic nature of imperial searches made most such efforts unsuccessful. The captured resources provided funding for reconstruction efforts, while demonstrating the material costs of resistance to imperial authority. The religious dimensions of Roman retaliation proved particularly devastating for Celtic cultural identity, as imperial forces systematically destroyed sacred sites and eliminated druids who had provided spiritual justification for resistance to Roman rule. Archaeological evidence from traditional Celtic religious centres shows signs of deliberate desecration during this period, with sacred groves cut down, ritual deposits scattered, and stone circles dismantled. The systematic persecution of druids, which had begun during the Mona campaign, intensified dramatically as Roman officials recognised their role in maintaining Celtic cultural cohesion and potential for organising future resistance. Surviving druids faced execution or exile, while their oral traditions and religious knowledge died with them or survived only in fragmentary form among scattered populations. The demographic impact of Roman retribution extended beyond immediate casualties to encompass systematic disruption of tribal population patterns and social organisation. Entire communities were relocated to prevent reformation of traditional kinship networks that had provided the foundation for military resistance. Archaeological analysis of settlement patterns during the immediate post-rebellion period reveals abandonment of many traditional sites combined with the establishment of new communities in locations that facilitated Roman surveillance and control. The forced movement of populations disrupted agricultural cycles, craft production, and trade relationships that had sustained Celtic society for centuries, creating economic hardship that persisted for decades after the military suppression of the rebellion. The brutality of Roman retribution operations gradually attracted criticism from imperial administrators who recognized that excessive punishment might provoke renewed resistance while hindering the economic recovery necessary for provincial profitability. Reports reaching Rome described systematic destruction that had eliminated not only rebel military capabilities, but also the productive capacity of entire regions that had previously contributed substantial revenues to imperial coffers. The governor's policies had created wasteland conditions across large areas of southeastern Britain, with abandoned settlements, uncultivated fields, and disrupted trade networks that would require massive investment to restore. Archaeological evidence from this period shows dramatic decline in material culture indicators, with reduced quantities of pottery, metalwork, and imported goods suggesting severe economic disruption throughout the affected regions. Emperor Nero's response to reports of excessive brutality in Britain reflected broader imperial concerns about maintaining provincial stability while maximising economic benefits from conquered territories. The emperor had initially supported Suetonius's harsh measures as necessary for preventing future rebellions, but growing evidence of economic devastation and continued unrest suggested that purely punitive policies might prove counterproductive for long-term imperial interests. Nero's advisors argued that systematic destruction of productive capacity would reduce Britain's value as an imperial possession, while creating ongoing security challenges that would require permanent military occupation at unsustainable cost. The emperor's decision to recall Suetonius and replace him with a more conciliatory governor reflected recognition that successful provincial administration required balance between punishment and reconciliation. The appointment of Publius Petronius Turpilianus as the new governor of Britain marked a fundamental shift in Roman administrative policy, from systematic retribution toward careful reconstruction designed to restore economic productivity while preventing future uprisings. Turpilianus brought extensive experience in provincial administration, having previously served in positions that required delicate management of relationships between imperial authority and local populations. His instructions from Rome emphasized the need to restore stability and economic growth, rather than continue punitive operations that had achieved their primary objective of eliminating organized resistance. Archaeological evidence from his governorship shows renewed construction activity, restoration of trade networks, and gradual recovery of material culture indicators that suggest successful implementation of more moderate policies. The new governor's approach to managing surviving Celtic populations reflected sophisticated understanding of the underlying causes that had enabled Boudica's rebellion while addressing Roman concerns about preventing future uprisings. Rather than continuing systematic persecution of all Celtic leaders, Turpilianus implemented selective policies that distinguished between irreconcilable enemies and potential collaborators who might be integrated into Roman administrative structures. Archaeological discoveries from this period include renewed construction of Romanized buildings in Celtic territories, suggesting that some tribal elites were encouraged to adopt Roman cultural practices in exchange for restoration of limited authority over their communities. This selective accommodation provided pathways for ambitious Celts to achieve status within the imperial system, while creating incentives for cooperation rather than resistance. The reconstruction of destroyed urban centres required massive investment in infrastructure and population resettlement that demonstrated Roman commitment to maintaining permanent control over Britain despite the rebellion's devastating impact. Archaeological excavations at Camulodunum, Londinium and Verulamium reveal systematic rebuilding efforts that began within months of Boudica's defeat and continued for decades as imperial authorities worked to restore these settlements to their former prominence. The new construction incorporated lessons learned from the rebellion, with stronger defensive walls, more strategic positioning of military installations, and architectural designs that facilitated rapid response to future security threats. The scale of reconstruction efforts indicates substantial imperial investment in Britain's future, while demonstrating determination to maintain Roman presence regardless of local resistance. The restoration of Londinium proved particularly significant for demonstrating Roman resilience and commitment to maintaining commercial networks that had been disrupted by the rebellion. Archaeological evidence shows that reconstruction began almost immediately after the military situation stabilized, with new wharves, warehouses, and commercial buildings constructed to more ambitious specifications than their predecessors. The rapid restoration of port facilities enabled resumption of trade relationships with continental markets, while providing employment for displaced populations who might otherwise remain potential sources of unrest. The new Londinium incorporated defensive features that had been absent from the original settlement, including earthwork fortifications and strategic positioning of military installations that would enable rapid response to future threats. The legal and administrative reforms implemented during Turpilianus's governorship addressed many of the grievances that had contributed to the rebellion, while establishing more systematic procedures for managing relationships between Roman authority and Celtic populations. New regulations governing taxation, military recruitment, and property rights provided clearer guidelines for imperial officials while offering some protection against the arbitrary abuses that had characterized previous administration. Archaeological discoveries of legal documents and administrative records from this period suggest more systematic record-keeping and bureaucratic procedures designed to prevent the type of corruption and abuse that had sparked the rebellion. These reforms represented recognition that sustainable imperial control required institutional changes rather than reliance on military force alone. The establishment of new military installations throughout former rebel territories reflected strategic lessons learned from the rebellion about the importance of maintaining adequate forces for rapid response to security threats. Archaeological surveys have identified numerous forts and fortlets constructed during this period, positioned to provide surveillance over potentially troublesome populations while enabling rapid deployment of troops to suppress future uprisings. These installations followed standardized designs that incorporated latest developments in Roman military architecture while adapting to specific local conditions and strategic requirements. The systematic nature of this military construction program indicates comprehensive strategic planning designed to prevent future rebellions through deterrence and rapid intervention capabilities. The cultural policies implemented during the post-rebellion period sought to accelerate Romanization of Celtic populations through incentives and educational programs rather than the coercive measures that had previously characterized imperial cultural policy. Archaeological evidence includes construction of Roman-style schools, baths, and temples in areas that had previously maintained traditional Celtic cultural practices. These facilities provided opportunities for Celtic elites to acquire Roman education and cultural knowledge, while demonstrating the material benefits of cooperation with imperial authority. The voluntary adoption of Roman cultural practices by increasing numbers of Britons suggests that these policies achieved greater success than previous coercive approaches in integrating native populations into imperial society. The economic recovery programs implemented throughout the affected regions required careful coordination between military security operations and civilian reconstruction efforts designed to restore productive capacity while preventing future unrest. Archaeological evidence shows systematic efforts to restore agricultural production through provision of seed grain, livestock, and farming implements to communities that had suffered losses during the rebellion and subsequent retribution. The restoration of craft production facilities enabled resumption of manufacturing activities that had been disrupted by the conflict while providing employment for displaced populations. Trade relationships gradually resumed as security conditions improved and commercial infrastructure was rebuilt, though full recovery required several years of sustained effort. The religious policies of the new administration sought to eliminate sources of potential resistance while providing alternative spiritual outlets that would satisfy Celtic religious needs without threatening imperial authority. The systematic persecution of Druids continued, but new policies encouraged adoption of Roman religious practices through construction of temples and sponsorship of festivals that incorporated some Celtic elements within acceptable Roman frameworks. Archaeological discoveries of Romano-Celtic religious sites from this period suggest successful synthesis of traditions that satisfied both imperial requirements and local spiritual needs. These hybrid religious practices provided mechanisms for cultural accommodation that reduced potential for religious-based resistance, while facilitating gradual integration of Celtic populations into Roman society. The long-term demographic changes resulting from the rebellion and its aftermath fundamentally altered the ethnic and cultural composition of southeastern Britain in ways that would influence the region's development for centuries. The systematic elimination of Celtic leadership classes created opportunities for Roman colonists and Romanized immigrants to assume positions of authority and influence that had previously been monopolized by tribal elites. Archaeological evidence shows increased presence of continental European settlers during this period. with distinctive pottery styles, architectural features, and burial practices indicating substantial immigration from Gaul and other Roman provinces. This demographic transformation accelerated Romanization, while reducing the potential for future Celtic resistance movements. The archaeological evidence of destruction and rebuilding throughout the affected regions provides detailed insight into both the scale of devastation caused by the rebellion and the systematic nature of Roman reconstruction efforts. Excavations at major sites revealed distinct destruction layers associated with Boudica's campaign, followed by evidence of comprehensive rebuilding that often exceeded the scale and sophistication of pre-rebellion construction. The speed and efficiency of reconstruction efforts demonstrate Roman organisational capabilities, while indicating substantial imperial investment in Britain's future development. The incorporation of defensive features and strategic considerations into rebuilt settlements reflects lessons learned from the rebellion about the importance of maintaining security while pursuing economic development objectives. The systematic reconstruction efforts that followed Boudica's defeat created the physical and administrative foundation for Roman Britain's subsequent development, but the rebellion's impact on historical memory would prove far more complex and enduring than its immediate political consequences. The primary sources that preserve Boudica's story reflect the perspectives of Roman historians who wrote decades after the events, creating accounts that served imperial propaganda purposes while inadvertently preserving details that would later inspire very different interpretations of her legacy. Tacitus, writing during the reigns of Trajan and Hadrian, provided the most detailed and psychologically complex portrait of the Iceni queen in his annals, and his biographical work on his father-in-law Agricola, who had served as a junior officer during the British campaigns. Tacitus's account reveals the sophisticated historical methodology that characterized the best Roman historiography, combining official military records with eyewitness testimony from participants who'd survived the campaigns. His description of Boudica draws upon direct observation by Agricola and other Roman officers who had encountered her during negotiations or witnessed her battlefield presence. The historian's portrayal emphasizes her physical imposing stature, describing her as exceptionally tall with flowing red hair that reached her waist, a powerful voice that could command attention across vast crowds, and a bearing that conveyed natural authority even in circumstances of defeat and desperation. These physical details, preserved through military observation and later testimony, provide rare insight into the personal characteristics that enabled her remarkable rise to leadership among traditionally fractious Celtic tribes. The speeches that Tacitus attributes to Boudica before the final battle represent sophisticated rhetorical reconstruction based on Celtic oratorical traditions and the political arguments that would have resonated with her diverse coalition. While the specific words cannot be considered verbatim records, the themes and arguments reflect genuine Celtic grievances and cultural values that Roman observers had documented throughout their campaigns in Britain. Her emphasis on freedom versus slavery, the corruption of Roman officials, and the divine sanction for resistance against foreign domination echoed authentic Celtic political discourse while demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of tribal psychology that had enabled her to unite previously antagonistic groups in common cause against imperial authority. Cassius Dio's later account, written during the early 3rd century, provides additional details that complement and sometimes contradict Tacitus's version, reflecting the evolution of Roman historical memory and the incorporation of legendary elements that had accumulated over time. Dio's description emphasizes Boudica's role as a religious figure, presenting her as a priestess queen who drew upon supernatural powers and divine inspiration to rally her followers against Roman oppression. His account includes specific details about her ritual practices, her invocation of Celtic deities, and her use of religious symbolism that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the spiritual dimensions of Celtic political authority. These religious elements, while potentially embellished through oral tradition, reflect genuine aspects of Celtic queenship that Roman observers had noted but not fully understood. The differences between these primary sources reveal the challenges inherent in reconstructing ancient events from accounts written by cultural outsiders who possessed limited understanding of Celtic society and political structures. Roman historians approached Boudica's story through the lens of imperial ideology that viewed barbarian resistance as temporary obstacles to civilizational progress rather than legitimate expressions of political autonomy or cultural identity. Their focus on military events and political consequences often overlooked the social and economic factors that had made the rebellion possible, while emphasizing individual leadership qualities that fit Roman concepts of historical causation. The preservation of these accounts, despite their imperial bias, reflects the profound impact that Boudica's rebellion had made on Roman consciousness, and the recognition that her story represented something more significant than routine provincial unrest. The medieval period witnessed fundamental transformation in Boudica's historical image as Christian chroniclers reinterpreted her story through theological frameworks that emphasized divine justice and moral instruction rather than political analysis or military history. Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, written in the 12th century, incorporated Boudica into a legendary genealogy of British rulers that connected her to Arthurian Romance traditions and biblical narratives of righteous resistance against tyranny. This medieval reconstruction transformed her from a defeated barbarian queen into a proto-Christian figure, whose rebellion prefigured the eventual triumph of British Christianity over pagan Roman oppression. The historical accuracy of these accounts mattered less than their moral and political utility for medieval audiences seeking to understand their own relationships with foreign authority and cultural identity. The Renaissance rediscovery of classical texts brought renewed scholarly attention to the original Roman sources, while introducing humanist interpretative frameworks that emphasized individual heroism and classical republican virtues. Tudor historians like Raphael Holinshed incorporated Boudica into national historical narratives that served contemporary political purposes, presenting her as an early example of British resistance to foreign domination that paralleled Elizabethan England's struggles against Spanish imperial ambitions. These interpretations emphasized her courage, determination, and patriotic devotion, while downplaying the religious and cultural differences that had separated her Celtic world from contemporary Christian England. The selective appropriation of classical sources enabled Renaissance historians to create usable historical precedents while maintaining scholarly credibility through reference to ancient authorities. The Victorian era marked the most dramatic transformation in Boudica's historical memory, as Imperial Britain's scholars and popular writers reimagined her as a symbol of British national character and imperial destiny. The irony of celebrating an anti-imperial rebel as an icon of Imperial Britain reflected the complex relationship between Victorian national identity and classical historical precedents. Victorian historians like E.A. Freeman and J.R. Green presented Boudica as an early manifestation of the British spirit that would eventually create the world's largest empire, arguing that her resistance to Roman tyranny demonstrated the same qualities that had enabled British expansion across the globe. This interpretation required careful editing of the historical record to emphasize her leadership qualities while minimizing the religious and cultural differences that separated Celtic Britain from Victorian Christianity and civilization. The archaeological revolution of the 19th and 20th centuries provided new types of evidence that both supported and challenged literary historical traditions about Boudica and her rebellion. Excavations at Camulodunum, Londinium, and Verulamium revealed the distinctive destruction layers that confirm the scale and intensity of the urban assaults described by Roman historians. The discovery of the Boudican destruction horizon in London Excavations provided physical evidence that validated ancient accounts while enabling more precise dating and analysis of the rebellion's impact. Archaeological findings of weapons, coins, and everyday objects buried during the crisis offered insight into the experiences of ordinary people who had lived through these dramatic events, supplementing the elite political perspective preserved in literary sources. The systematic archaeological investigation of Iron Age Britain during the 20th century revealed the sophisticated political and economic structures that had characterized pre-Roman Celtic society, challenging earlier assumptions about barbarian primitiveness that had influenced historical interpretations of Boudica's rebellion. Discoveries like the Snettisham Talks demonstrated the remarkable artistic and technical achievements of Celtic metalworkers, while indicating the substantial wealth that had attracted Roman attention and motivated imperial exploitation policies. Excavations of Celtic oppida revealed complex urban settlements with defensive walls, specialised craft areas, and evidence of long-distance trade relationships that contradicted Roman propaganda about bringing civilization to barbarian lands. These archaeological insights provided context for understanding the rebellion as resistance to the destruction of sophisticated indigenous societies rather than simple rejection of civilizational progress. The development of scientific archaeology during the later 20th century enabled more precise analysis of battlefield sites, settlement patterns, and demographic changes associated with the rebellion and its aftermath. Radiocarbon dating, soil analysis, and environmental archaeology provided detailed insight into the economic and ecological impact of Roman retribution, while revealing patterns of recovery and cultural adaptation in the decades following Boudica's defeat. The discovery of mass burial sites associated with the rebellion offered evidence about casualties and treatment of the dead that supplemented literary accounts, while raising new questions about the scale and nature of violence during the conflict. Scientific analysis of human remains provided information about health, nutrition, and living conditions that illuminated the social and economic pressures that had contributed to widespread support for the rebellion. Modern historical scholarship has approached Boudica's story through interdisciplinary methodologies that combine literary analysis, archaeological evidence, and anthropological insights about Celtic society and Roman imperial administration. Scholars like Graham Webster and Miranda Aldhouse Green have reconstructed the political and cultural context that made the rebellion possible, while analysing the specific grievances and circumstances that transformed local resistance into province-wide uprising. Their work has emphasised the systematic nature of Roman exploitation and the sophisticated political organisation required to coordinate resistance across multiple tribal territories. Contemporary historians have also examined the rebellion's impact on Roman imperial policy and the development of more nuanced approaches to provincial administration that balance coercion with accommodation. The feminist historical movement of the late 20th century brought new attention to Boudica's significance as a female leader, who challenged both Roman imperial authority and traditional gender expectations. Scholars like Vanessa Collingridge and Caitlin Matthews have analysed her story within the context of Celtic women's roles and the unusual opportunities for female political authority that existed within pre-Roman British society. Their research has revealed the religious and legal traditions that enabled queens like Boudica to exercise legitimate authority while examining the specific circumstances that allowed her to transcend normal gender limitations and assume military leadership over diverse tribal coalitions. These feminist interpretations have emphasized her agency and political skill, while challenging romanticized Victorian portrayals that focused primarily on her victimization and emotional responses to personal tragedy. Contemporary popular culture has continued to reimagine Boudica through various media that reflect changing social values and political concerns while maintaining her appeal as a symbol of resistance against oppression. Television documentaries, historical novels, and digital media have introduced her story to new audiences while adapting historical details to serve contemporary narrative purposes. These popular representations often emphasize themes of women's empowerment, indigenous rights, and resistance to imperial domination that resonate with modern political concerns, while sometimes sacrificing historical accuracy for dramatic effect. The persistence of popular interest in Boudica's story demonstrates the continuing relevance of themes related to cultural identity, political autonomy, and individual courage in the face of overwhelming odds. The development of post-colonial historical perspectives has provided new frameworks for understanding Boudica's rebellion within broader patterns of imperial expansion and indigenous resistance that characterized the Roman Empire's relationship with conquered peoples. Scholars influenced by post-colonial theory have emphasized the systematic nature of Roman cultural destruction and economic exploitation, while analysing the rebellion as an early example of anti-colonial resistance that prefigured similar movements throughout world history. These interpretations have highlighted the sophisticated political and military organisation required to challenge imperial authority while examining the cultural and psychological impact of foreign domination on indigenous societies. The comparison between Roman imperialism and modern colonial experiences has provided new insight into the universal dynamics of imperial expansion and local resistance. The archaeological investigation of Roman Britain continues to provide new evidence about the rebellion's impact and the subsequent development of Romano-British society that emerged from the conflict's aftermath. Recent excavations have revealed additional sites associated with the destruction and rebuilding phases, while providing more detailed information about demographic changes, economic recovery, and cultural adaptation in the generations following Boudica's defeat. Scientific analysis of environmental data has illuminated the ecological impact of warfare and systematic destruction, while revealing patterns of agricultural recovery and landscape modification that resulted from Roman reconstruction policies. These ongoing discoveries continue to refine understanding of the rebellion's historical significance, while providing new perspectives on the complex processes of cultural change and adaptation that characterized Roman imperial expansion. The preservation of Boudica's memory in British national consciousness reflects the enduring power of her story to inspire resistance against perceived oppression, while embodying concepts of courage, determination, and cultural identity that transcend specific historical circumstances. Her transformation from defeated barbarian queen to national heroine demonstrates the flexibility of historical memory and the ways in which past events can be reinterpreted to serve contemporary political and cultural purposes. The statue erected in her honour near Westminster Bridge in London symbolises her incorporation into British national mythology, while acknowledging the complex relationship between historical accuracy and cultural significance in the construction of national identity. The continuing scholarly debate about specific details of Boudica's life and rebellion reflects both the limitations of available evidence and the ongoing relevance of questions about imperial authority, indigenous rights, and cultural survival that her story raises. The absence of Celtic written records means that her voice reaches us only through Roman sources that viewed her through the lens of imperial ideology, creating interpretative challenges that mirror broader issues in colonial and post-colonial history. The archaeological evidence provides crucial supplementary information, but cannot fully compensate for the loss of indigenous perspectives and cultural knowledge that was systematically destroyed during the Roman conquest and subsequent cultural transformation of Britain. Boudica's legacy ultimately transcends the specific historical circumstances of her rebellion to encompass broader themes about human dignity, cultural identity, and resistance to oppression that remain relevant across cultures and historical periods. Her story demonstrates both the possibilities and limitations of individual leadership in challenging systematic injustice, while illustrating the complex dynamics of cultural conflict and adaptation that characterize encounters between different civilizations. The continuing evolution of her historical memory reflects changing social values and political concerns while maintaining core themes about courage, determination, and the defense of fundamental human rights that ensure her continued relevance for future generations, seeking to understand the relationship between individual action and historical change. The archaeological and historical evidence that preserves Boudica's story provides crucial insight into one of the most significant challenges to Roman imperial authority, while illuminating the sophisticated political and cultural achievements of pre-Roman Britain that were systematically destroyed during the conquest and subsequent Romanization. Her rebellion marked the end of independent Celtic political authority in southeastern Britain while demonstrating the resilience and organisational capabilities of indigenous societies that had developed over centuries of Iron Age cultural evolution. The ultimate failure of her uprising ensured the permanent establishment of Roman rule in Britain, but the memory of her resistance continued to inspire subsequent generations who faced their own struggles against foreign domination and cultural oppression.